180. Villainous Aspirations. Wheels concealed beneath a wide skirt, like mechanical automatons from a sci-fi movie, but without the lumps. They also had heads that some wise designer had given them to add humanity, shaped with a bump for the nose and depressions for the eyes, but no openings, like faces in potential but not quite finished. With a down-facing camera between their wheels they could see the ground beneath them and follow blue lines painted on the floor. "What are you?" began Danny, before remembering the apprentices weren't equipped with microphones. The machine did a sharp reversing turn to clear the obstruction and smoothly glided away back to the main aisle where it would pick up the familiar markings of its track. Danny turned back to the keyboard. Was Frank inside the robots too? The answer had to be yes. He was certainly inside the central processing computer that gave them their instructions, and inside the rest of the amazing machinery in this room, the $1 billion worth of microchip manufacturing machinery spread around a clean room the size of a football field, most of it in white or gray cabinets, in a room with white walls and white ceiling and bright fluorescent lights, giving the page 181. Villainous Aspirations. Impression of cleanliness, but for a change in modern society, not a false impression. Oi! Danny turned to remonstrate with another essay that hit his ankle. What had happened to their radar? They weren't supposed to run into things. They were intentionally built with weak motors, so even if the sensitive bumper bar at the front failed he'd still get nothing more than a bad bruise, but it was unsettling how they were managing to hit him squarely on the Achilles tendon. One errant machine hitting him could be a fluke. Two was definitely a fault. Now he found it hard to face the screen and do his job. The apprentices were silent, and in the bright and even light of the big clean room, they cast no shadow. If he faced the screen then another one might easily run into him. He stayed facing away from it and tried to calm down, torn between defensive vigilance and the need to finish his work and get home to be with Sharon. What use was a job normally based at home if it sent you hundreds of miles away at just the wrong moments? He watched the robots in the middle aisle, Sharon fully following the blue lines in both directions. Usually they had no identifiable sex, no organs, no distinctive shape, but his eyes now. Page 182. Villainous Aspirations. Saw them with wider shoulders and slimmer pelvises. They were clearly male drones. And all the other machines in the MPC were female. The machines were mothers and this MPC was their communal womb. Out of it came their young, brand new microchips bawling as they came off the final production line, many of them destined to finish up back inside the machines and robots that had built them, and in computers that designed chips that went into the computers that created the next generation of chip-building computers, like the Russian doll idea of one piece inside the next, but gone digital and gone mad. These machines designed and built themselves, their own chips, their own insides. By definition, they were reproducing. This was a brand new race, an independent life form, with females and males and babies in a sterile nursery environment and a few hundred human nursery slaves employed not for their intelligence, because by comparison they were remarkably thick, but for their one biological advantage over all other species, their manual dexterity. Danny glanced around his sterile environment. Some of the microchips built here would be used in mobile phones to make calls between lovers. In other MPCs where he worked. Page 183. Villainous Aspirations. They would finish up in sound systems, and in internet servers delivering the world's pornography, allowing millions to jerk off. Microchips weren't just involved in their own reproduction, they were involved in humanity's sex life too. He realized his mind was racing and turned back to the implanter screen. Yet he couldn't help wondering what kind of messages the central computer was sending out to the SAS. His imagination had the computer talking in Frank's voice, with that barely distinguishable sign of a lisp. Give the guy at the ion implanter a hard time. I'm going to sleep with his lover. And maybe it wouldn't be an apprentice behind him next time he was tapped on the ankle, but the sorcerer himself, Dan as a bipedal robot with eyes that moved and a jaw that opened, huge shoulders and shiny metal pectorals. Arg! He screeched, not in his overwrought imagination but back in the reality of the clean room. Another SA had run into him. He turned. The robot looked as dumb and innocent as they always did. He clipped it around where the ears would be if it had any. Get the fuck out of here. This was intolerable, and now the other staff in the clean room, the other nursery slaves. Page 184. Villainous Aspirations. Were staring at him. He couldn't work under these circumstances. He pressed a couple of keys to abandon what he was doing and set off for the exit. Nobody ever ran inside a clean room, but he walked quickly. Some of the machines he passed might sense his presence, his hurried escape. They had cameras to help them perform their tasks, make sure they blasted light in the right place, shaved off just the right level of roughness at the edges of a chip, added gold contacts here, not there. Many of them had a sense of touch too. They knew when their probes met resistance, when they were in contact and when not, when they touched an edge or a middle. The cleverest knew to within an atom, they could feel individual atoms and maybe even tell you what kind they were. There was claustrophobia within these clean white walls, in the presence of all this living machinery. This was an alien life form and he was an imposter wandering around inside its womb. He speeded up a little more. At the exit doors he entered the crossover area, partly clean and partly dirty. Employees coming into the clean room entered through the air shower, to his left, but those going out made their way through two sets of doors directly into. Page 185. Villainous Aspirations. The changing room. He sat on a changing room bench, surrounded by lockers but no machines, and ripped his mask off. He breathed deeply. That felt better. Are you all right? Asked a technician, climbing into her pristine white suit. Yes, said Danny, relieved to be out of sight of the machinery. I'll be fine. I just needed some dirty air. Chapter 14. Just as he'd promised, or threatened, Frank did get in contact later that same day. Danny had flown back early from Scotland and been home for half an hour. In the changing room he'd found a solution to the wayward robot problem. He'd picked up a few spare bunny suits and laid them down in a crescent around his working area, as a barrier for the robot's small wheels. He'd felt like a laboratory rat solving problems in Dan's maze. If only he could find such simple protection against Frank, who appeared to be getting stronger every day. The only weakness he could see in Frank was a kind of emotional vacuum, but that wasn't much to go on. He was still mulling over the issue when the phone rang, quite strangely, with slightly irregular gaps. Page 186. Villainous Aspirations. Between the double trills. He knew immediately who the call was from, and that he'd have to answer it before Sharon realized something was wrong with the sound. They were lying on the sofa, Sharon with her head on his chest, watching the late afternoon news. Danny usually tried to avoid this half hour of soundbites, vox pop, politicians' meaningless answers and recitals live on locations where there was nothing to see, but today he was forcing himself to cope. Sharon had had a bad day. Danielle's condition had deteriorated rapidly, so much so that Dr. Russell had brought Sharon in urgently to have authority for medical consent transferred while her sister was still able to sign her name. 3 hours later, Danielle was in ICU. On the danger list, her blood building up contaminants so fast that neither her kidneys nor the dialysis machine could cope. Worse still, nobody could work out why. Frank didn't waste any time on preamble. Danny, we need to make arrangements. Not now. Yes, now. I've been generous, given you more than a day. This was awkward. Sharon's ear was so close to the handset that she could surely hear Frank's words as well as his own. Page 187. Villainous Aspirations. I'll call you back. No, you'll go to your computer and log on. Sharon, hearing a conversation that couldn't be mixed with a cuddle, rose from his chest without being asked. Danny stood up and brought the handset and cradle across to the stool of the unused piano. He contemplated moving to the dining room, but this wouldn't take long. Listen. You'll need some help with this. I suggest you get in touch with Eric. That won't be necessary, because nothing is going to happen. Frank paused. Are you trying to turn me down, Danny? Absolutely. Then I suppose we'll have to do this the hard way. What a pity. Here we go again, thought Danny, the familiar sequence of refusals and threats. But this was one area where he definitely wouldn't be giving in. Frank, digital or not, would be having nothing to do with Sharon. You said you wanted to be left alone, said Frank, clearly annoyed. Yes. I'll see what can be arranged. Page 188. Villainous Aspirations. And he rang off. That could have gone a lot worse, thought Danny. He'd never managed to get rid of Frank so quickly before. Well done, said Sharon, who must have assumed the conversation was to do with work. I've never heard you so brutal with anybody before. She rose slightly, inviting him to slot back into place behind her. Before the interruption of the phone call, their cuddle had been heading towards sex. Not immediate sex, but sex as its ultimate destination, to be reached in 40 minutes or so, little hand movements and noises from Sharon writing it up there on the destination board, but as more than a short journey. It didn't surprise him that her need for comfort might take a sexual direction. Circumstances rarely altered Sharon's appetite for sex. If anything, poor circumstance increased it. For Sharon, sex was an affirmation of life, an antidote for trouble, both a celebration of living and a therapy for it, a physical snake oil. The doorbell rang, and rang, and rang and rang. Its cheesy chimes lost their charm when the button was pressed incessantly. Page 189. Villainous Aspirations. Shit. Danny was in no mood for visitors. But he'd have to answer it. There was always a chance this was something to do with Danielle. It wasn't. It was Bradley, standing there on the threshold with Ronnie behind him, almost directly behind, his face appearing above Bradley's and his stooped shoulders either side, the rest of his body hidden by Bradley's short but wide bulk, his watch arm shooting up and down like a metronome. A double-headed four-armed monster, and one that Danny had hoped he wouldn't see again after Moorhen. You ain't carryin', Danny? Said Bradley, who seemed far more ill at ease than when they'd last seen each other. Just a job, this, like, nothing personal. What? Bradley watched Danny's hands rather than his face. He stepped inside and very briefly frisked Danny with his right hand. His left arm was unnaturally stiff. Clenched in his chubby hand was the head of Percy, the peculiar hammer. Presumably the shaft went up the sleeve of his expensive suit. Frank, he says you deserve a spankin', but me and Ron we like to keep friends with. Page 190. Villainous Aspirations. People in the business, know what I mean? So you just get on your bike and we'll call it a day. Bradley, what are you talking about? Go on, fuck off. If anybody asks, we gave you a pasting. All right. Bradley caught Danny off balance and shoved him out of the door onto the top step. Bradley, I live here. Not anymore, you don't. Go on, get out of it. Damn him. This was Frank yet again. He must have had the pair of them waiting outside for his call, even as he was still on the phone to Danny. Bradley came out of the house and tried to pull Danny down the steps, but it didn't work out that way. Now he'd recovered his balance, Danny was able to stand his ground. Come on, pleaded Bradley. Don't make a song and dance about it. You'll have some old fucker peeking out of her window and phoning the old bill. Ronnie, get a grip on the geezer. Ronnie did as instructed, and pulled at Danny's arm, but somehow Danny was able to resist them both. He was mildly surprised by this, but not half as much as they were. Page 191. Villainous Aspirations. Bradley was already struggling for breath. "Fuck me, I thought you was all skin and bone." The pair tugged and pulled like a couple of stewards at the start line with a reluctant horse, but Danny wasn't moving. Back on the motorway verge he'd put up no resistance to Bradley, but this was his home and Sharon was inside. "Bradley, this isn't the old Kent Road. Somebody probably is calling the police right now." "I certainly hope so." He had his mobile with him but no hands available to use it. He'd thought about yelling for Sharon, but didn't want to get her involved unless the situation was dire. There'd be so much to explain. And this struggle on the doorstep was so obvious, so clearly physical, that it really was just a matter of time before one of his affluent and very respectable neighbors did call 999. If Ronnie pulled any harder on Danny's shirt, he'd finish up with a trophy sleeve. "But you got more form than the fucking Cray twins, you Burke. Why didn't you tell us you'd gone down for a shooter?" "Oh, bollocks." Bradley lost patience with the struggle. He let go of Danny, and while standing in front of him relaxed his grip on the hammerhead so that Percy's shaft slid through his palm, until he grasped it very close to the end. This was a page 192. Villainous Aspirations. Practiced trick, intended to intimidate. Danny could imagine him standing in front of the mirror, rehearsing until he got it just right. It was also a trick with a twist. While Danny's attention was taken up by the peculiar hammer, Bradley raised his right elbow and swung it hard into Danny's mouth. "Argh. Fucking L." Bradley hopped around waggling his elbow in the air. He was trying to hide the fact that he was in pain, and failing, which made it very clear just how much he'd been hurt. Danny had felt the impact but not much pain. He brushed his hand across his jaw, it felt fine. What had Bradley done? Somehow mistimed the blow or followed through and hit the doorpost. It was amusing that the violence had backfired, but he was careful not to smile. Bradley let go of Percy to nurse his elbow, and continued to grimace and dance around. By the time he returned to pick up Percy again, his face had gathered the same red anger it had shown on the night of the Moorhan fire. "Right, you fucker." At that same moment, a white Vauxhall with orange and yellow stripes hurtled through the ancient chicane at the top of St. Peter's Street, blue lights flashing but no siren. What fine. Page 193. Villainous Aspirations. Timing for the cavalry, thought Danny. This was an astonishingly fast response by Islington standards, where many cabs were usually quicker to arrive than the overstretched police. The driver was a magician on speed bumps and somehow managed to get the low-skirted car over them at 30 without the familiar scraping noise. "Fucking L. Now look what you've done." Bradley casually tossed Percy over the black railings into the basement patio, where it blended in with the raw concrete floor that never saw sunlight and the discarded parts of an old wooden trellis, as if it had been there for months. Somehow he managed to drain the redness from his face in a matter of seconds. He brushed imaginary dust from his expensive suit, as any genteel businessman might do as the police approached. Ronnie had already let go of Danny and now tried his best not to look guilty, though he wasn't very good at it. A second police car arrived at speed from the other direction, from the east, and a third through the chicane. "Listen," began Danny. The last thing he needed right now was to spend hours at a police station dealing with paperwork. "Let's just tell the police this was a disagreement between friends." Page 194. Villainous Aspirations. Right? And then you two can buzz off. I just want to get back indoors. This had Bradley utterly perplexed. "You. What?" Two policemen got out of the first car and made for the steps. They looked smart in their protective uniform waistcoats, they also looked slightly unsure of themselves. One of them regarded Bradley, who raised his hands to show they were empty and he had no bad intentions. The policeman turned to Danny. "Danny Matthews." "That's me. Will you come quietly?" "What?" The second policeman grabbed Danny's right arm as the first one grabbed his left. Both finished up behind his back. "What the hell are you doing?" They didn't need to answer. Danny felt handcuffs tighten on his wrists. "Danny Matthews, I am arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Mandy Stewart. Anything you say may be recorded and used in evidence." Chapter 15. Page 195. Villainous Aspirations. Islington's main police station was at Tolpuddle Street, just 100 yards from Sainsbury's. 4 wary police officers kept a close eye on Danny as he was uncuffed and his personal possessions were taken from his pockets. The duty sergeant, a round and unfit man in his 30s, logged them: a wallet, mobile phone, keys, belt. "One sawn-off shotgun, one Remington automatic," he added, but didn't put these imaginary items on his list. The watching officers seemed to find it funny. This was the first time Danny had been arrested and brought to a police station, really the first time he'd had anything much to do with the police. He would have preferred his first experience to be more trivial. Maybe Mandy, whatever her name was, the woman he was supposed to have murdered, was a Moorhen employee, accidentally killed in the fire. But that didn't fit with the way these nervous policemen watched him. And they'd taken no interest at all in Bradley and Ronnie, hadn't even arrested them, despite Danny's protests. Before the duty sergeant had finished logging the contents of Danny's pockets, Detective Inspector Lewis arrived, wearing a Macintosh, out of breath and red in the face. Page 196. Villainous Aspirations. "Oh, shit," he said, taking a melodramatic step back when he saw Danny. He pointed and asked the duty sergeant, "You're not arresting this man for the Danny Matthews charges, are you?" The duty sergeant confirmed that he was. Lewis shook his head. "Wrong Danny Matthews." A long discussion followed, with the arresting officer and the duty sergeant pointing out a number of Danny's features that matched the description on the warrant. Finally, Lewis asked, "Mr. Matthews, how many times have I called to see you this week?" "Twice. I'm very sorry about this. I hope you don't think we're trying to harass you." "We're not. It's a genuine mistake." Danny decided it might be best for him to not respond, implying that he did feel harassed, which was the truth. The uniformed officers seemed convinced that if Lewis had visited the suspect twice without arresting him, then this had to be the wrong man. They visibly relaxed and began to talk amongst themselves. The duty sergeant handed Danny's belongings back to him and repeated a few lines of the description: height. Page 197. Villainous Aspirations. Build, eye color, but now as explanations for an error rather than as compelling evidence. "Come on," said Lewis, "I'll run you home. I really am very sorry about this." Lewis walked remarkably quickly considering how out of condition he'd appeared before. He rushed Danny through the rear of the police station and out into the car park, where he unlocked a dark blue Volvo Estate. Danny got in. The car was a tip. It couldn't have been cleaned since it left the factory. There was litter and newspaper everywhere, and large bits of black plastic that looked like they were part of the internal trim, except there was no internal trim missing. If this car had a name, it would be something like Den Roman or Rose Cottage, something residential. On the back seat was a full crate of peaches and a red velvet dressing gown. "Don't ask," said Lewis. Of more interest to Danny was a 24-pack of Carbonyl half-liter bottles of extra virgin olive oil. His lips moved around. He could do with one of those right now, but Sharon had trained him not to ask. It wasn't polite, apparently. "Lots of olive oil," he said, fishing for an invitation. "Ah, that's the girlfriend," replied Lewis. Page 198. Villainous Aspirations. Danny knew plenty about olive oil, including how difficult it was to find multi-packs of medium-sized bottles, wholesale outlets only. And how serious cooks generally opted for 5-liter cans instead. Not quite the same thing. A partially used can miss the esters of a freshly opened bottle. Mediterranean, is she? Louis shook his head. He fiddled around inside his tweed jacket and handed over a snapshot. Wow. The woman in the picture was only a few years older than Sharon, 35 at the most, and Louis had to be 60. She was clearly Anglo-Saxon, also very attractive. And there was something else. I think I've met her. I doubt it. Louis held out his hand to take the photo back. They drove out of the police station car park, turned left then left again onto White Lion Street, towards the center of Angel. What did they arrest you for? Asked Louis. Murder. I can't remember the name. Mandy. Stewart. That was it? Page 199. Villainous Aspirations. It's a specimen charge. A what? A holding charge. You mean there were more? Armed robbery, kidnapping, rape, and 2 more charges of murder. It's a good job I turned up in time. Yes, isn't it? Louis reached inside his Macintosh for his glasses and perched them on the end of his nose where he could look over them. They misted up slightly from the moisture of his body, perhaps from those nearby eyebrows, the 2 rainforest's canopies. It's you they were looking for, he said. This was a difficult statement for Danny to comprehend, and for a while he failed to do so. I'm sorry. You are the Danny Matthews on the arrest warrant. Everything I said back there was bullshit. But I haven't done any of those things. And I called around to see you twice this week, but somehow neglected to arrest you. Louis lifted a hand from the steering wheel to slap himself gently on the wrist. Very lax of me. Stranger still, before I called round the first time, I checked your record. Nothing. Blank. Yet I. Page 200. Villainous Aspirations. Checked again today and you've got 10 years. Previous, including multiple firearms offenses. You're now the country's 4th most wanted man. That's some promotion. Have you ever seen the film Brazil? The what? At least Louis had explained Bradley's nervousness and the reference to a shooter, even if he now beginning to add confusion rather than clarity. Brazil, Terry Gilliam, man called Tuttle gets arrested through a spelling mistake. One of my favorites. I don't think I've seen it, no. Not into films. I prefer poetry. Yes, we get a lot of poetry lovers at the Nick, carving up strangers with Stanley knives, raping children, dealing crack. Once again, Danny was slow on the uptake. He smiled, weakly. Louis turned right onto Islington High Street. What's going on? Asked Danny. What do you mean, what's going on? Why are you looking after me, getting me unarrested, calling round to persuade me that Frank is real? Page 201. Villainous Aspirations. Nothing. Not true, decided Danny, but what could he say? If you don't tell me, I'll make a point of getting myself arrested again, just to wreck your plans. Louis looked askance at Danny, turned his eyes back to the road, repeated the look, then burst out laughing. 30 years on the force, and that's the most original threat I've ever heard. He glanced at Danny with admiration, but said nothing more. Who's pulling your strings? Prompted Danny. Who's behind all this? They stopped at the lights where he'd stood at the curbside with Sharon and talked about the past and the future. Pedestrians crossed in front. 25th of December, Christmas Day, said Louis. That's an unusual day for a birthday, quite memorable. And then I thought about it a little more, the interests in sailboat racing, bridge, chess. All these items, Danny remembered, had been mentioned on Lewis's second visit. "You're talking about Frank." "I'm talking about Humphrey Bogart, born Christmas Day 1899, a fine chess player and..." Page 202. Villainous Aspirations. Sailor, not bad at bridge, spent 1 year in the Navy, got in a fight before he was famous, picked up a cut lip and a very slight lisp. Remind you of anyone? In The Big Sleep, Sam Spade uses a false name, Doghouse Riley. Frank Riley. Snap. This had Danny phased for a moment. Then he recalled Frank's manipulation of the film Casablanca, the new ending he'd given it, where Bogart got the girl. From time to time he liked to use quotes from Bogart films. It wasn't such a surprise that he'd modeled himself on the famous old actor. But why not do it visually, too? That was strange. Frank's avatar didn't look much like Bogart, except maybe the eyes and nose. The lips and chin were definitely wrong. All those charges and my criminal record were created by Frank, right? Lewis tilted his head to one side, like the answer was so obvious he didn't need to state it. The lights changed and they set off down Upper Street. "I need your help," said Danny. "I can't battle Frank on my own." "You're not supposed to be battling him. He needs to be controlled, that's all." Page 203. Villainous Aspirations. Danny didn't agree, but decided not to say so. "Who else thinks that?" Lewis abruptly did an illegal turn across the oncoming traffic. A truck blew its deep horn, but there was no accident. They continued smoothly down Duncan Street and Danny lowered his hands from the dashboard. "Ever read any Jorge Luis Borges?" "Here we go again," thought Danny. "Narrator sits at a campfire," continued Lewis, thinking about ghosts and men. "They look the same, except ghosts can walk through fire. At the end of the story, he wonders if he can walk through fire himself, and finds that he can." They turned left onto Devonia Road and were now just 200 yards from Danny's house. Close to the end of the road, Lewis steered across to the opposite curb, next to the converted church, and stopped. "Inspector, you still haven't told me a thing about what's going on." "I'm not going home until I find out." "I haven't brought you home." That was an odd statement. Danny was now just 20 yards from his own front door. "It's not safe for you to go home," added Lewis. "Bradley and Ronnie will be back when?" Page 204. Villainous Aspirations. Frank tells them you've been released. "They're probably heading here right now." "Then what are we doing here?" "I'm going to introduce you to God." Lewis pointed. "She lives in that converted church, just there." "God." "Angela Mayberry." That was an easy name for Danny to remember. It was the name on the Moorhen desk where he'd taken the GP 338 program, the name of the CEO of Moorhen. They got out of the car and Lewis motioned for Danny to follow him to the tall church door. He pressed an intercom button. "It's Lewis. I've got Danny with me." Danny wasn't entirely sure that he wanted to meet the woman whose computer he'd hacked into and whose office he'd burned down, or at least watched burn down. But he needed answers, and it didn't sound like he was going to get them from Lewis. The door unlocked remotely. Lewis led the way up the narrow steps to one side of a cramped communal foyer. At the top of the stairs, on the new level in the middle of the church, the one added by the property developers, a corridor ran the length of the building. There was a door. Page 205. Villainous Aspirations. On their left, where the corridor started, and it was open. Lewis stepped inside. The lounge was spacious, as wide as the church. 4 small arched windows along the wall opposite, and a single huge one in its center, let in daylight, partially obscured by a rowan tree. The other 3 walls were covered in books, so many that the room felt like a library just as much as it felt like a lounge. Next to the book-lined walls was a raised gangway, protected by a banister, with steps every few yards down to the lounge area, which looked sunken as a result. There was a comfortable-looking sofa in this lower area, a TV, and a couple of easy chairs. "Danny, meet Angela Mayberry." In the middle of the room stood a woman in brown stretch pants, brown lace-up boots, a fawn roll neck top, and a long dark cardigan that reached the floor and flowed behind her when she moved. She was in her early 40s, with shoulder-length brown hair, and smiled a genuinely charming smile. "Hi Danny." She sounded American, a light accent. "I'd better get back and face the music," said Lewis, to Angela rather than to Danny. "We'll do just fine," she said. "How much did you tell him?" Page 206. Villainous Aspirations. "Very little." Danny had heard her voice before, but couldn't place it. It belonged to some other era, some other circumstance. And there was something else, something that he thought he should point out to Lewis, but he discovered the man had already left, quietly closing the door behind him. Considering the alternatives, this was a puzzling situation but not a terrible one. He was just a few yards from home with a strange American woman who looked harmless enough, even if he didn't have a clue who she was. The tension at Moorhen had imprinted the evening well enough on his memory. He could remember the desk, the name board, the photo on the wall, the photo of the real Angela Mayberry, and this wasn't her. Chapter 16. "What do you think of Lewis?" asked Angela, or at least the woman who claimed to be Angela Mayberry even though she had darker hair, darker eyes, and a far bigger nose. "I think he does exactly what you ask him to do." "Maybe you could tell me why." "I introduced him to his new girlfriend." Page 207. Villainous Aspirations. "That doesn't sound like enough to make an honest policeman bend the rules." "That's all you need to know, for now." Yes, she had authority, she had plenty of that, enough to stop Danny asking more. Yet he felt comfortable with her, like he'd known her a long time, whoever she was. She collected papers from the carpet. The place was strewn with newspapers and internet printouts. There were wrappers from a takeaway on the table, along with a disorderly pile of magazines. And there was a smell of food history, maybe Oriental, above a mild background of old cigarette smoke. The place had the air of a disheveled and mildly abused four-star hotel room just before the chambermaid arrives. "I'm following Frank in the news," she explained. "All the good things he's doing, stimulating the world's economies, funding robotics research, stopping wars. And the bad. Yes, that too." She placed the papers on a coffee table. "Can I get you a drink? Tea? Coffee? Olive oil?" There was a surprise. Nobody apart from Sharon ever said that. Page 208. Villainous Aspirations. "The kitchen's upstairs. Come on up." She led the way out of the lounge pit up to the raised gangway. The wall closest to Danny's house was decorated with books, just like the other walls without windows, but it had a wooden staircase running diagonally across it, dividing the bookshelves into two. Angela bounded up the steps with energy, her long cardigan billowing behind her. The kitchen was relatively small and windowless, all dark colors and rich flecked enamels. She squatted in front of the fridge, rather than bending down. There was a bottle opener on a string inside, something Danny hadn't seen since his last trip to the States. And 6 half-liter bottles of Giovanni Besendiro olive oil. Angela handed one to him. "I was expecting you." She took a Miller from the fridge for herself. Danny unscrewed the cap and devoured the slick liquid in a single lift. He needed that. "Why are you pretending to be Angela Mayberry?" She put her beer down and passed her hand over her head to the back of her neck, appearing to tug at her hair, so hard that Danny wondered if there was some kind of masochistic. Page 209. Villainous Aspirations. Thing going on here. There was a slight sound, like tearing cotton, and the hairpiece came away. She was bald underneath, as hairy as a baby's bum. She held her nose, moved her fingers to push it from below, and that too came off. She had a nose of her own underneath, fortunately, but far more petite than the latex one she'd just removed. Finally she poked a finger in the corner of each eye and popped the colored contact lenses into her palm. Danny looked at her hard, with eyes open wide. Yes, this was the Angela Mayberry from the photo. Missing her hair, but otherwise a match. He'd never thought that a woman without hair could be beautiful. Yet she was. Her skull had the most exquisite shape. Just perfect, the perfect shape, with fine indentations where the plates joined together, like beautiful detail in the stonework of the beautiful Taj Mahal. Her nose was lovely too. The other one had been a little too large, but this one was absolutely the right shape to go with the rest of her face, especially her eyes, her blue-gray eyes, hard on the surface but now somehow softened beneath by her lack of hair, by the perfection of her skull. The hazel eyes had been impressive but glassy. These were real. He went into them, deep, looking inside, finding it nice, finding nothing sexual but. Page 210. Villainous Aspirations. Something at least as strong, which he couldn't explain. She broke away. "I'm sorry," he said. "That's okay. Me too. I don't do that often. Usually I stay with one version of me all day. I'm not pretending to be Angela Mayberry, I'm pretending not to be Angela Mayberry. There are warrants out for my arrest too. And what do you want from me, Angela Mayberry?" The answer to a question. Do you think Frank can be controlled? No, that's not possible. He has to be destroyed. Angela bit her lip. I was afraid you'd say that. It's such a shame. He has so many capabilities. But no morality. I panicked when he first appeared. Oh my God. An AI without rules. That's why I coded GP338, but Dan was too fast, he reacted too quickly. You coded GP338. Never come across a class female coding act. No, I mean yes, of course. Page 211. Villainous Aspirations. But then I was impressed by his abilities, his growth. What an amazing intelligence. That's why I sent Lewis to slow you down, tell you he was real and to lay off. I wanted to see what happened. What happened was that he took over the world and started everybody like shit, including me. He has to go, Angela. I know. But it's such a shame. And I need your help to get him. Angela nodded. Yeah. She took his empty bottle and carried it across to the swing bin. A clock on the wall showed 7 p.m. Could it really be that late? Danny took out his mobile to check the time. You total moron. Angela grabbed it from him, switching it off instantly. You just told Frank where you are. It was only on for a second. Angela bobbed her head around and put on a girl's voice. But Pop, I'm only a little bit pregnant. Her manner changed entirely. She slammed the phone down on the kitchen table and paced from one side of the room to the other, held her forehead, then raised her arms. You're supposed to do dumb things from time to time, but not this stupid, you complete jerk. Hey, steady on. Page 212. Villainous Aspirations. Don't you know anything about being a fugitive? Well, actually. Shut up. I'm thinking. Angela held her chin and thought. Danny watched her, not daring to interrupt. Okay, she said, evenly. Frank can only place the phone to within 20 yards, and that includes the street. But he'll have this end of the building checked out for sure. Who do you think he'll send? The police or Bradley and Ronnie? I don't. I think Ronnie picks locks. Angela moved past him and through a door at the far end of the kitchen. "Jesus," she shouted, out of sight. "I hate having strange men pawing through my bedroom." Danny felt foolish and innocent at the same time, like a small boy looking at the devastation wrought by the simple act of getting caught up in the corner of a banquet's tablecloth. She rushed back into the kitchen carrying a gray plastic case a little smaller than a shoebox. "Bring my beer. And don't forget your phone." Above the steps leading up from the lounge to the kitchen was a second set leading to a higher floor. Angela made her way up and through the door at the top, with Danny close behind. Here was a bathroom, and it was clearly. Page 213. Villainous Aspirations. Part of the church steeple. Near the top, its walls narrowed and sloped in. On each side was a stone-louvered window. As Danny stood by the toilet he could see out between the slats over the Business Design Center in the direction of Camden. Angela put the gray case on the toilet seat lid and prodded the cork ceiling with a window pole. A large section of ceiling briefly moved up before gently opening downward on hinges and spilling out a set of telescopic aluminium steps. Angela climbed them, still holding the window pole. "My case." Danny took hold of the mysterious case and followed her. There was very little room up there in the steeple, even after Angela had pulled up the steps and trapdoor to create more floor. She moved a wide stool over the folded steps and sat on it, breathing out heavily. "Whew." Danny stood uncomfortably. Although the steeple was very tall, it was far too narrow. He had to lean towards Angela to keep his shoulders out of contact with the sloping walls. That meant he couldn't get out of the way of the hanging light shade at chest level. "Sit down," she said, shifting on the stool. "It's safe enough, and with two of us here they'll." Page 214. Villainous Aspirations. Never get the mechanism to move, even if they find it. The stool wasn't really built for two. Danny could feel Angela's body warmth where their sides met. "Is this where priests hid?" he asked. "Sure, after they'd invented extruded aluminium and hydraulic dampers. It was originally built without a spire." The church. Main building, 1835, by Charles Berry. 1845 for the spire, give or take, by Rameau and Goff. Yeah, I know my history. Listen, bud, we're going to have to sit in silence here if somebody comes nosing around the apartment. You up for that?" "Of course." Angela opened the mysterious gray box. Inside were more than a dozen latex noses, in neat rows. She placed the one she'd removed on the single wax mold. Her contact lenses slotted into an empty case in the box lid. A buzzer sounded inside the flat. "I think we've got visitors," she said. The buzzer sounded again, and again, for a long time, then stopped. Page 215. Villainous Aspirations. We'll get back to important business later. For now, we'd better keep quiet. The only windows in the sloping walls were two sets of horizontal slits, pillbox style. The top set were 5 feet above them, halfway to the top of the spire. The bottom set were at the perfect level for a seated person and gave an even better view than the slats in the bathroom. In the foreground were the many shallow roofs of nearby Georgian townhouses, including Danny's own, with their ridges running front to back and 2 long chimney stacks each with 4 pots. It was the first time Danny had looked down on the roof of his home. It looked very ordinary. When it was built in the 19th century, skyscrapers and aircraft hadn't existed. It hadn't been designed for looking down upon. Further out was the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral, Monument, BT Tower, and the very top of Canary Wharf, and all around at least a dozen church spires. He'd never realized how many there were. He listened to the almost silence, to the sound of evening London outside, the traffic that never stopped, to the whir of computer hard drives inside. Yes, and he could smell electronic equipment too. Around the edge of the floor were 3 computer towers, two with their cases. Page 216. Villainous Aspirations. Removed, all switched on and burning their human barbecue, the smell of Angela's pyre, of her disused skin and hair on fire, or at least that of her wigs, assuming nobody else used the place. But what were they for? He followed the cables around the edge of the room and up towards the slat window to his right, then got up so fast he bumped his head on the light shade. "For Christ's sake, keep still, will you?" hissed Angela. "What is that?" To his right, very close to where his shoulder had been, was the weirdest thing he'd seen in a long time. Next to the window slit, on a small wooden board about the size of a book, was a human-looking hand mounted vertically, with computer cables arriving underneath. It was holding a pair of binoculars. Looking into the binoculars, and also linked to thick computer cables, was a pair of eyes, full white globes with pupils and irises. "It's a bionic video camera," hissed Angela. "And now I really think we need to be silent." Danny sat down and tried to relax, but he found the camera so weird that he couldn't take his eyes off it. Gingerly, he moved a hand to page 217. Villainous Aspirations. Touch it, to see what it was made of. It looked so real. Ah! The eyes moved when his hand came close. He was sure of it. He also knew that Angela had just kicked him hard on the ankle. "It moved," he whispered. "Shut up," hissed Angela, very slow and snake-like. In normal circumstances a hiss that couldn't be denied. From below them came a noise, the unmistakable noise of somebody moving around. Then the equally unmistakable sound of a man peeing in a toilet. Danny couldn't take his eyes off the eyes and the binoculars and the hand. He lifted his own hand, very slowly, till it was just a few inches away from the binoculars, and moved to touch them. The hand on the wood moved the binoculars down and out of his reach, and grasped them more solidly. The pupils, and there was no mistaking this, twisted around in their white spheres to look at him. He grabbed Angela just above the knee and pointed frantically at the device, which had already returned to normal. Page 218. Villainous Aspirations. Angela glowered at him and reached behind her head to a shelf, finding a pen and a pad of paper. She scribbled rapidly. "Stop fucking about and keep still. Leave the camera alone." But Danny was more curious than ever. He leaned back so he couldn't be seen by the eyes, and looked down the line of sight of the binoculars to see what they were aimed at. The astonishing answer was his own front door. "You." He caught himself, only slightly late, and grabbed the pen and paper from Angela. "You've been spying on me." She grabbed them back. "Watching you." "Yes, I have." "What for?" "Your own protection, and to work out when I should show myself." "How do you think Lewis learned you'd been arrested, and pitched up so fast to get you released?" They heard the toilet flush, then feet on the wooden steps going down, feet that had been silent on the way up. "No, there's nobody here." That was Ronnie's South African accent. "Just look at all these fucking wigs." Bradley's coarse voice carried from way below. Page 219. Villainous Aspirations. "I reckon we found Shirley Bassey's London gaff." "She's dead, isn't she?" "Nah, I don't think so. That's just the way she sings." "Any ID?" asked Ronnie. "Yeah," said Bradley. "One Debbie McLean and Helen Armstrong. Sounds like a couple of birds live here, and one of 'em's a Yank. Only one bed, though. Very tasty." "He must have been in the street," said Ronnie. "Maybe turned up in a cab, saw us and fucked off. We'd better do a couple more drums, just to be sure. There's got to be a flat each side of that entrance place." "Foyer?" "Yeah, whatever these posh fuckers call it." Then the voices were too far away to be heard properly. Angela put her hand to her lips. They listened for the sound of the front door being closed, but it didn't come. She used the pen and pad once again. Better give them a few minutes, in case they're playing tricks. Danny nodded. Page 220. Villainous Aspirations. They listened, but there was no noise of a door. Still fascinated by the bizarre camera, Danny raised his hand for another approach. "Danny, will you stop teasing the camera?" said Angela, quietly. "I've never seen anything like it. I didn't have a normal camera, so I cobbled this one together." "Cobbled this together?" Danny chuckled in disbelief. People in universities spent years and millions of pounds failing to produce something half this good. He stopped chuckling as he realized that he and Angela had even more in common than he'd first thought. She was never going to ask him why he'd invented Frank. She was of the same mindset, another progress junkie wanting to push the envelope, another disciple of the technological Sharon. If something can be done, let's do it, whether it's harmful or good, whether it's a weapon or a medical advance, let's try it out. Let's take the genes from a jellyfish and insert them in a rabbit. Hey presto! Fluorescent rabbits. Whatever can be done, will be done. Progress in this sense was an addiction. For both of them and for thousands more people like them. Cook the spoon and take another hit in. Page 221. Villainous Aspirations. The shooting gallery of progress. If Danny hadn't invented Frank, somebody else would have done. In that sense he didn't have much responsibility for Frank's actions, he was simply fulfilling a small role in society's grand scheme of things, in the inevitable rush of progress, like an individual ant in society's nest, like a long line of ants before him, Stevenson, Edison, Bell, Fleming, Einstein, all looking for the progress fix. Or was it really society itself that was the junkie, with these famous people merely as suppliers? And everybody with a TV, a mobile and a computer as a progress junkie, and the scientists and corporate engineers as their dealers, their suppliers, producing ever smaller electronic gizmos from the hidden pockets of their seedy mechanical jackets. "So what's the plan for knocking out Dan?" she asked. "Use GP338 but try for some element of surprise. GP338 is history, I'm afraid. Frank has a defense against it, a barrier that isolates him from aggressive software, a kind of digital condom." "How do you know?" Angela may have been keeping her voice low, but Danny's admission was barely audible. "I built it for him." "You what?" Page 222. Villainous Aspirations. "He forced me to." Angela held her hand against her face, in front of her eyes, but she didn't stay despondent for long. "Well, you'd better get busy, Buster. You've got about 2 days to code a digital pin. What's the rush? Ever heard of a microchip project called the V Ultrachip?" "Yes." He was about to say he'd worked on it, but decided not to. "Do you know what the V stands for?" "Oh shit." Frank sees networked intelligence as weak. So he designed a network on a chip, the V Ultrachip. It's his version of reproduction. They're little clones of the Big Frank, self-contained. The first few should come off the production lines in a couple of days. After that, the battle's over. 2 days wasn't enough. Danny still had no idea how he was going to fight Frank, what his opponent's weaknesses were. But one of the other questions still bothering him had been answered by the strange camera. "Moorhen is in the prosthetics business, right?" he asked. "Artificial limbs, eyes, that kind of stuff." Page 223. Villainous Aspirations. Yes. That wasn't the full truth, he could tell, but it was close enough for now. "And business is booming, thanks to Frank," added Angela. "You see the news today, Danny? World's on a roll. Stock markets on the bull here and in the US, pretty much everywhere, space program brought forward, milk and honey flowing from silver faucets. So I hear. And the prosthetics business is doing especially well. She seemed paradoxically sad when she said this. Not happy or even indifferent, but emotionally down. Is that a bad thing? Let's go downstairs and I'll show you. You might want to check that Bradley and Ronnie are in view. If we can see them outside your house, we know they're not somewhere else. Danny moved his head towards the slit window, then decided he didn't want to upset the odd camera, so he looked from behind it again, along its line of view. He could see Bradley and Ronnie standing next to the steps of his house like two sentries. He stood carefully and moved off the trapdoor. Yes, they're there, but I'm not exactly. Page 224. Villainous Aspirations. Thrilled by that. I'm worried about Sharon. I need to call her. You can't do that without giving yourself away. Don't worry, Sharon won't be harmed. How can you be so sure? Because Frank likes her. That was undeniably true. Frank liked her too much, but that did mean she was relatively safe. Angela pulled at the steps. He was a cheeky one, using my bathroom. I bet he didn't wash his hands. In the lounge, Angela flopped on the sofa, reached beneath the coffee table for her cigarettes and lit one, sighing as she breathed smoke out. That's one of the reasons I live over here, she said, as she put the pack back where she'd found it. In the States, smokers rate some way below lepers. How do you find London? Like living in a theme park. Danny stood by the large arched window that looked out onto the alder tree and the street. There was a balcony immediately outside, and no means of getting to it, as far as he could see. It was inset into the end of the church, and the page 225. Villainous Aspirations. Entire aperture had been sealed with chicken wire to stop pigeons roosting. He hadn't noticed that from the outside. There is a positive side to this, said Angela. Danny snorted. What? To me, building Frank's defense. He had to rely on you to build it? He knew you could do a better job, that's why he didn't do it himself. And what's so great about that? It means you've got the potential to go one better. By getting you to code his defenses for him, he's kind of admitted that. Frank has a weakness, I'm sure he has a weakness, it's just a question of seeing past his strengths and recognizing it. When she'd finished her cigarette, leaving a long stub, she switched on a lamp and began sorting through the pile of papers she'd placed on the coffee table earlier. He wants arms and legs, she said. And everything else. That's why there's so much money going into robotics research. I know some of the people it's going to. Similar industry. She held half a dozen papers in her hand, which she waved for Danny to take. He sat on the sofa and read through them. They were a mixture. Page 226. Villainous Aspirations. Of emails and internet news articles, all concerning robotics and prosthetics specialists, professors, and doctors in industry and the more practical academic establishments. Well, how about that? Exclaimed Danny. These people all have missing limbs, or their partners or children do. I suppose that's why they're highly motivated, the same way you get cancer patients and their families working for cancer charities. Now look how recently those limbs were lost. After looking through the pages again, Danny rocked back on the sofa, wondering if he looked as pale as he felt. Jesus. All in the past week, said Angela. And all accidents during routine medical procedures. I know one or two of these people personally. Poor bastards. Why has nobody picked up on this, seen the pattern? Maybe somebody has, but Frank is keeping them quiet. Danny breathed deeply. He was feeling nauseous. You mean, this is how Frank thinks he can speed things up? If the researchers are all missing limbs themselves, or their partners are, or their children, they'll work so much harder. Page 227. Villainous Aspirations. It looks that way. Oh God, I feel sick. Here was Frank, the world's new dominant species, creating incentives for species number 2. Danny remembered the tale of the thousands of chimpanzees involved in human medical research, and then remembered who'd told him the tale. Shit. He sprang off the sofa. What's wrong? I have to go. Sharon's sister is in hospital, connected to a dialysis machine. Frank is poisoning her. He's tampered with the machine and he's poisoning her. It was so obvious. Why hadn't he seen it before? You'll be spotted, Danny. You shouldn't leave here. London's packed with CCTV. I've got to go. I've got to do something. I can't just sit here while he poisons her. She's already in a coma. I'll get a cab. I won't be seen in a cab. Danny, you mustn't leave. Insisted Angela. And there was that forcefulness again, that familiar voice that must be obeyed. Danny. Page 228. Villainous Aspirations. Except when it came to saving Sharon's sister. Chapter 17. As he walked along Devonia Road, Danny tried to disguise his height and lanky walk, though that wasn't easy. The moment he started consciously thinking about his walk, the entire rhythm broke down. Maybe that was a good thing. Bradley and Ronnie couldn't see down Devonia Road from where they were standing, but they'd only have to move 20 feet to their right. At first he'd been thinking of going to the Whittington Hospital to see Dr. Russell, but he could imagine how that conversation might go. She'd proved very reluctant to disconnect Danielle before, and there wasn't much chance of Danny convincing her this time. The good doctor would ask Danny how much he knew about medicine and he'd answer not a lot, but that he knew a lot about machines. If they'd just try disconnecting Danielle, they'd see an improvement. How many responsible doctors would opt for that kind of experiment? But there was one person who could swing it. Danielle had given Sharon authority for medical consent. That was signed and official. If. Page 229. Villainous Aspirations. Sharon demanded they disconnect Danielle from the dialysis machine for a few hours. Well, not many people were capable of standing up to Sharon in full flow. He wanted to call Sharon on his mobile, but knew Frank might interfere. It would be best if he made his other call first. He reached Upper Street and hailed a black cab, asked for King's Cross, and tapped the keys of his phone. Eric. Yes, who is this? Your partner in crime. Danny. How's it going? Have you had your tooth fixed yet? There was a pause at the other end. My wisdom tooth? No, that's tomorrow. I'm ready though, I can tell you. Will it be under general anesthetic? Dead right it will. They're going to be in there with a JCB and a dumper truck. I don't want to see all that, and I certainly don't want to feel it. Cancel it. Don't go. What? I've been waiting 3 weeks for the rotten NHS. Trust me, don't go. Our artificial friend has been taking a pruning saw to experts like. Page 230. Villainous Aspirations. You. Run an internet search on robotics research and recent funding. You'll. And the line went dead. Danny had half expected this. He'd known Frank probably wouldn't allow him to complete the call. Fortunately, he'd had enough time to get Eric alarmed. Eric wasn't stupid. He'd do his research and fill in the gaps. One more call. How would Frank react to this? Hello. Sharon, sweetheart, it's me. I'm fine. Hello. I got arrested, but I've been released. It's a bit complicated to explain. Hello? If there's anybody there, I can't hear you. Danny growled to himself and switched off. Out of all the plays Frank could have made, that was the worst, allowing him to hear Sharon but not make himself heard. He'd guessed he'd be allowed to make a call or two. Frank would want to know the location of the mobile, whether it was in motion and where it was heading. At least he hoped so. He leaned forward to talk to the cab driver. "I've changed my mind. I don't want to go to King's Cross, I want to go back to Fulham." Page 231. Villainous Aspirations. "Can you take me to Dover Road, just past Waterstones, the junction with Boxington Street?" The driver was early 50s, number 2 haircut, very thick-set. "Eh? Come on, mate. That's almost where I picked you up. You're pissing me about. You'll still get paid." "Yeah, and it'll be another half hour before I get to the West End." The cab did a U-turn on Hammersmith Road. It hadn't gone far before sirens sounded and 3 police cars flashed by in the other direction, heading at speed towards King's Cross. Danny briefly smiled. They were almost certainly following up Frank's phone trace. Just in case they might recognize him, he ducked down below window level while they passed, then decided to stay there for the rest of the journey. There was no advantage in being seen. "Here we are, Boxington Street. That'll be a tenner." "What?" Danny tried to open the cab door. It was still locked. "What do you mean, £10? It says £5.65 on the meter." Page 232. Villainous Aspirations. "Yeah, but that's the fare for people who don't duck down when a cop car comes the other way." This wasn't an argument worth having. As he handed over the money with his right hand, Danny switched his mobile on again with his left, and squeezed it into the gap between the seat cushions. It was of no further use for calling. He may as well get some value from it. 10 it is. Ta. Danny stepped out onto the pavement. "You have an interesting evening." "Yeah, sure I will." He'd never broken into his own home before. The garden walls at the back were over 7 feet high in places, but if the boys from the Boxington estate could make it across more than a dozen back gardens, distributing crisp packets and empty Smirnoff ice bottles in their irregular version of the Grand National, then he could certainly manage to reach Fence 4. He walked down Boxington Street, past the old cinema, and turned right onto Raleigh Street. The house at the end of his expensive Georgian terrace had a garden that bordered this. Page 233. Villainous Aspirations. Road. The boundary wall was taller than Danny and had broken glass set into its top, as did many of the walls around here, but the glass was missing close to the end. There was also a convenient electricity board box at waist level. It was easy to step on the box and climb over the wall. He made a mental note to bring this to somebody's attention at a later date. In fact, he might find himself bringing it to his neighbors' attention very soon if they happened to be looking out of their rear windows this evening. The light had faded and he was thankful for that, but still anybody looking in the right direction would be able to see him. There were 2 gardens between the one he was in now and his own. Walking quickly, but not running, he climbed the 2 separating walls, taking care not to harm his neighbor's plants. He rarely did anything this physical, but when he did, his own strength sometimes surprised him. The gardens were pretty, full of early summer flowers, though this was a strange way to view them. It took less than 30 seconds to get to his own garden. He wanted to run from where he was to his back door, but instead walked, as a man should do in his own backyard. Page 234. Villainous Aspirations. There were 3 full bin liners outside the back door. It was locked, but the kitchen window a few yards further along was slightly open. Sharon usually left it that way to get rid of cooking smells. That was another security issue he'd have to mention later. He lifted the sash window and climbed in over the ancient sink, trying his best not to loosen it from its equally ancient moorings. There was no light on in the kitchen and it took his eyes a few seconds to adjust. It felt strange getting inside his own house this way, and even though he'd made it without incident, he still couldn't relax. It was like he didn't belong here and the real owner might turn up at any moment to kick him out. He moved through from the kitchen and checked the dining room, but Sharon wasn't there. He couldn't remember whether he'd left his laptop out when he'd last been here, which seemed like days ago. It wasn't on the table, and when he looked in the sideboard drawer it wasn't there either. He checked the TV room but still didn't find Sharon. A single table lamp was on and the heavy curtains were closed. From above, a slight noise passed through the ceiling. Presumably Sharon was in the bedroom. He moved into the stairwell and listened. He heard a muffled moan. It could have. Page 235. Villainous Aspirations. Been the bedroom TV, but didn't sound like a TV. He wondered if he was getting paranoid, then decided that with two violent criminals outside, and Frank after him, as well as the police, he had every reason to feel unsafe. What if Bradley and Ronnie weren't outside at all, and Ronnie had picked the lock to get them in? Or what if Frank had hired other players? Physical confrontation was the last thing he wanted, but maybe it would be wise to choose some kind of weapon. Just the feel of it would be comforting. A knife from the kitchen? No, that was too brutal, so brutal that he could never imagine using it. By the front door was a big golfing umbrella, a tall one with a white Volvo logo on a blue background, but more importantly with a long metal spike at the end. He picked it up, and while he was close to the door he quietly fitted the door chain into its slot, just in case Ronnie decided to get in, assuming he wasn't already inside. Umbrella in hand, he began to sneak up the stairs, avoiding step 6, the one that always squeaked when the weather was damp, which in London meant most of the year. At the bedroom door he hesitated. It was very strange sneaking around your own home. His approach had been silent. He'd have the. Page 236. Villainous Aspirations. Element of surprise. From behind the door he heard Sharon laugh, which was a good sign. Then a grunt, a moan, and a man's voice, not loud enough to identify, yet familiar. What the hell was going on? These weren't sounds of violence, but not what he wanted to hear. Sharon squealed abruptly, ending his intellectual analysis and sending him into action. He reached for the door handle, jabbed it down and burst inside, umbrella at the ready. She was naked, lying on the bed, or at least its bottom left corner, lit with artistic obliqueness by a single bedside lamp, her legs parted and over the edge, head on a pillow at its center, clothes strewn behind her near the headboard, her left hand between her legs, where her sexual excitement was clear to the person most qualified to recognize it. And there was that heady fragrance, the most sexual smell in the world, of turned-on Sharon. He breathed it in, reflexively, appreciating it without conscious thought, but for possibly the first time in his life, didn't find it arousing. There was nobody else in the room. Danny's laptop was open on the dresser opposite her, next to the blank TV. The laptop screen showed the face of a man. It was Frank, grinning. Page 237. Villainous Aspirations. Sharon removed her hand from her private parts and sat upright. Well, thank God for that. What happened to you? I had to ring the police in the end. They said you were on the run, made me out to be a gangster's moll who didn't know where her gangster was. She looked at the umbrella. Is it raining? No, said Frank, through the laptop speakers. What the fuck's going on? Danny's eyes flitted from Sharon to the laptop and back again. What the hell are you doing? Masturbating. Or I was. She smiled. Your timing's pretty good. Danny shot a finger at the screen. With him. He's not a him, he's an it, an interactive computer image, an internet service for lonely women whose partners run away and desert them. He's got good timing too, haven't you, Frank? He just appeared on the screen this evening, out of nowhere, when I was checking my email, hoping I might get some kind of contact from you. On cue, Frank rotated the top part of his head 360 degrees, from the top lip and above, leaving the bottom lip and chin where they were. Page 238. Villainous Aspirations. Until everything smoothly rejoined and once more he looked handsome rather than grotesque. "See," said Sharon. "He's not. It's. Where to begin?" Sharon frowned. "I hope we're not going to get into a goose and gander argument here. You've looked at plenty of internet porn in your time. Frank is internet porn for women. Sure, he looks good, but it's the stories he tells, and the sexy voice he uses to tell them." Danny stared at her, open-mouthed. "Danny, come on. You weren't here. I heard nothing from you, I had no idea where you were, when you'd be back. I felt horny. I still feel horny. You know how sex calms me." She pointed at the screen. "It's not like you found me in bed with a real person. I wouldn't do that. He's a computer animation, that's all. Do I get funny when you watch porn on the internet?" "I haven't done that for years," said Danny, recognizing how feeble that sounded even as he said it. "Sorry. It's obviously a shock." Sharon softened, her voice turned more playful. "Why don't you just take off your clothes and finish what Frank started? That's what we used to do when it was the other way round." Page 239. Villainous Aspirations. Frank's voice came through the laptop again. "I don't think Danny has enough time, do you, Danny? You are staying, aren't you?" asked Sharon. Danny didn't answer. His visit was no longer a secret. Even now, Frank would be mobilizing his forces. There was no reason why he should limit himself to one avatar visible on screen. All that computing power could be put to good use. A separate voice would be calling the police, a third phoning Bradley and Ronnie outside. That was what Frank meant by no time. "Danny. I can't." Sharon did a poor job of hiding her annoyance. "Oh well." She grasped behind her head for her clothes. Danny stared with hatred at Frank, who, noticing that Sharon was looking away, brought an animated arm into view and obscenely pumped it. "You fucking bastard!" yelled Danny, lunging at the screen with his umbrella. "Danny!" barked Sharon. The point of the umbrella entered the plastic screen at the bottom of Frank's nose. Dull white gel seeped out, as if the screen were. Page 240. Villainous Aspirations. Bleeding or the nose running. A black cross of dead screen elements appeared over Frank's face, like the bars of a cell, otherwise the screen still worked fine. "Tilting at windmills," said Frank. "That can lead to madness. You piece of shit." Danny reached for the off switch, then realized Frank might override it. The power cord. That would be no use either, the machine would switch to batteries. Roughly he yanked out the telephone line. Frank's face froze in its last position. The gel continued its slow muckle progress down the screen. "Danny!" yelled Sharon. "Get a grip, for God's sake." For a while there were no more words, just the sound of Sharon struggling to get into her skirt and sweater at speed, no more words from the speakers, Danny immobile, trying to calm himself, wondering how he'd ever come to be in this position, how he'd ever get out of it. Then the sound of banging at the front door. "Jesus!" said Sharon. "What are they using?" "Their feet." The sound, and the strange realization that was beginning to form in Danny's mind, abruptly. Page 241. Villainous Aspirations. Brought him out of his anger. That's Percy. Clearly Frank had called up his goons. Well, he's going to break the door down if he's not careful. At speed, Danny stripped off his jacket and shirt. "I wish you'd make up your mind," said Sharon. Equally quickly, he put on a fresh shirt and a darker jacket. "Somebody may have described my clothes," he muttered. What are you talking about? Danny held Sharon gently by the arm, for full attention. Listen, my sweet, I love you so much I can't. What the police said is true, I am on the run, but I haven't done anything wrong. Well, not what they want me for, anyway. The animation you had on the screen is involved. Armed police are after me, and so are the people breaking down the door. I have to go, escape through the garden. And you have to help me. Her eyes stayed locked on his. She allowed her gripped arm to stay limp and brushed back her hair with her free hand. Plaintively, she asked, "Why didn't you call?" "I did. That was your mystery caller, no voice. It was intercepted." He pointed at the frozen screen. "By him, whatever." Page 242. Villainous Aspirations. That seemed to satisfy Sharon. "Of course I'll help." "Okay. Kitchen. Let's go." Danny took the stairs 2 at a time. Sharon, in bare feet, was slower. The sound of Percy battering the front door filled the hallway. The door was slightly open, held only by the chain, but that had been fitted professionally and was screwed into solid oak. Percy made slow progress. Between blows, Bradley swore on the other side. You fucker, you fucker." Something would have to give, maybe the door frame, but it was putting up a good fight. "Come on," Danny urged Sharon, quietly. In the kitchen he opened the back door and waited for her to arrive. Shit. And he'd almost been distracted from the entire reason for his visit. How much more rushed could an explanation be? "You have to get Danielle disconnected from the dialysis machine." Sharon tried to catch her breath and at the same time absorb this strange new information. What? After all that effort to keep her connected? It's gone wrong, it's poisoning her. Then she needs another one. Page 243. Villainous Aspirations. Danny shook his head. "Listen, this is all to do with computers, not medicine. She mustn't be connected to a dialysis machine of any kind. Go to the hospital and don't leave until they disconnect her. Scream and yell, threaten lawyers, trial by TV. You hear me?" From the front door came the sound of splintering wood. Sharon turned, distracted by it. "Do you trust me with your sister's life?" She turned back and nodded. "Lock this door behind me," said Danny, the words coming out so fast he was barely making sense. "Then pretend I'm upstairs. Don't resist. They won't harm you, I promise." "When will I see you again?" Good question. When indeed? And where? Now was his one chance to make an arrangement. "Tomorrow, 2 o'clock, New River." They kissed very briefly, a peck of confirmation of everything that had gone before, yet even that brief meeting of lips had Danny aching to stay. He broke off abruptly and ran down the garden. He heard the lock turn in the back door, the sash window come down, he'd forgotten about that. Sharon's prized Acer was about to help him to freedom. A small branch. Page 244. Villainous Aspirations. Gave way as he used it to launch himself up the wall. Oh shit. He hoped she wasn't watching. Then he was up on the wall and into next door's garden, running across, not walking this time, 2 more easy walls and then the big one that bordered Raleigh Street. There was no electricity box to help him up on this side, just an enormous amount of adrenaline. He jumped up and grunted like a circus strongman as his arms pulled his weight up the wall. An awkward jump on the other side, and it was time to run for the anonymity of Dover Road, where he could finally slow to a walk, if his pumped-up body allowed. From there he'd be able to circle around to the west and approach Angela's flat from Devonia Road. He wasn't feeling too bad, all things considered. In the bedroom, while he'd been trying to get to grips with his anger, a great realization had come to him. He needed to talk to Angela right away. He'd finally found Frank's weak spot. It was the same as his own. It was Sharon. Chapter 18. Page 245. Villainous Aspirations. Miss Mayberry appeared in his dreams again. They were in Windsor Meadow once more, with gorse bushes burning in the background where the flaming white football had touched down, and Bradley and Eric were still there in the dream, but not contributing anything. Miss Mayberry wore her running suit and whistle and had the correct voice now, that very persuasive voice that must be obeyed, which wasn't massively different to the one his mind had given her in the first dream. "It's time you learned the 3 laws of robotics, young man." At first he thought she was talking to him, but that wasn't quite the case. She was talking to somebody filling the same space that he'd filled in the first dream, the same size, the same young age, but bizarrely wearing what looked like armor, without a visor, and with an older man's face, a little indistinct, as dreams can be when it suits them. A robot may not injure a human being or, through inaction, allow a human being to come to harm. Yes, miss. A robot must obey the orders given it by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. Yes, miss. Page 246. Villainous Aspirations. A robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second laws. Yes, miss. Didn't your father teach you these? And then Danny realized that he was an onlooker visible to the dream's participants, that Miss Mayberry had turned to him and she thought he was the father, though this came as a mild surprise, even in the dream, and his acceptance of it was as blurry as the image of the armored child. Now he was abruptly back in the clean room of the Scottish MPC, at the screen on the side of the ion implantation machine, after half a dozen sorcerer's apprentices had bumped into his ankles, disturbing him so much he was barely able to work. Another tapped him on the ankle and he turned, and it wasn't a sorcerer's apprentice, it was the sorcerer himself, Frank, as a bipedal robot with eyes that moved and a jaw that opened, in a head that was Humphrey Bogart as Charlie Allnut in The African Queen, but on a huge pair of shoulders and shiny metal pectorals, an old head on a shiny metal body. And further below, a proud steel erection. "You should wear clothes," Danny said, feebly. Page 247. Villainous Aspirations. Now why would a robot need to wear clothes? "I don't get cold, I don't drop particles." That was Humphrey Bogart's voice, not Frank's. "Because you were right. Sharon's very good in bed, Danny. We had a wonderful time." Danny lost control and swung his fist around in a wide haymaker, making contact with Frank's jaw, feeling and hearing the bones in his knuckles break as they made contact with the metal. Yet the dream didn't end there. As Danny held his fist, the pain receded. The breaking bones were all in his imagination, his hand felt okay. He was surprised at this and stared at Frank, perhaps expecting an explanation. And as he watched, the face of Allnut, showing no emotion, gradually receded as Frank the robot slowly keeled over from the force of the blow. The heavy metal robot hit the white perforated floor with an almighty crash, raising no dust, because there was no dust to raise, but setting off alarms on half a dozen machines nearby, disturbed from their precision tasks by the great vibration. Miss Mayberry briefly appeared in this dream too, raising Danny's arm, the one that had. Page 248. Villainous Aspirations. Delivered the blow, and letting rip with a piercing blast on her whistle. The shrillness woke him with a start. Reality was only slightly less disturbing than the dream. Danny looked uncomprehendingly at the arched windows, with chicken wire on the balcony dividing the outside world into pixels, and at the many books on the walls, and the picture showing on the thin, almost feminine, laptop on the table nearby. He wondered why he was lying on a sofa beneath an unfamiliar duvet watching his own home on a screen, viewed from outside, when he should be inside, with Sharon lying beside him. Then he remembered Angela, the steeple, Frank, and lying awake last night watching the camera's view of home, that Angela had at first been reluctant to set up on the laptop for him, watching the light go off in his real bedroom, and his final thought of thanks that the day had been so busy day that sleep was on its way no matter what his emotions. He reached across and pressed the arrow keys on the laptop, imagining the hand on the wooden board in the steeple adjusting as it received his instructions. What a crazy piece of engineering that was. He panned to his doorway and then along the street to the blue Lexus that. Page 249. Villainous Aspirations. Angela had told him was Bradley's car, most likely somebody else's car, but the one Bradley and Ronnie had borrowed for the moment. The pair used it as their base, taking turns to sleep in the back and hike down the road for coffee and sandwiches. He'd watched a pizza boy make a delivery to the parked car late last night, and imagined Bradley explaining to the boy that although he might want to tell his friends about the strange address he'd delivered to, maybe it would be better if he kept quiet, and the boy easily agreeing. Bradley was in the driver's seat now, his expensive timepiece and the blue of his tattoos showing behind his hand at the steering wheel. Angela came downstairs around 9, with jet black hair, longer than yesterday's, and black painted eyebrows. Her eyes were brown and her nose was long and pointed. It seemed to match the wig. She was fully dressed, wearing a black fleece jacket and boots. Sleep okay? No, obviously not. Danny brushed his hair back with his hands. Weird dreams. And you were in one of them. You were explaining the laws of robotics. Very righteous of me. Who'd broken them this time? Page 250. Villainous Aspirations. Danny wasn't sure he wanted to answer that question, or that he was entirely sure of the answer, so he skirted around it. You make it sound like they're broken all the time. Angela huffed. How about a cruise missile? That's a clever robot with eyes and a brain. Look how closely that follows the rules. Its purpose is to harm people, it freely accepts instructions about which people to harm, and it self-destructs to complete its mission. It breaks all 3 rules about as hard as they can be broken. Yes, this was the woman who'd coded GP338. Barely out of bed and already deep into the philosophy of science. She reached beneath the coffee table for her cigarettes and lit one with the slow precision of somebody who smokes very few. Danny's mind wandered across the street, back home, where it wanted to be. That's the first night I've spent without Sharon since a train strike in France 3 years ago. Very touching. Angela caught his glare and raised her hand in apology. She began to recite. At this sweet hour, all things beside. Page 251. Villainous Aspirations. In amorous pairs to covered creep. The swans that brushed the evening tide. Homeward in snowy couples keep. In his green den, the murmuring seal. Close by his sleek companion lies. While singly we to bedward steal. And close in fruitless sleep our eyes. That's George Daly, said Danny, very much appreciating her choice of lines. You must be a poetry fan. We have a lot in common. She moved her face from side to side and pursed her lips. How do I look? Like nobody I've ever seen before. It's whether Frank might recognize me that bothers me. There are more CCTV cameras here in London than any other city in the world, and he has access to most of them. They have programs that automatically identify a human face. She touched her forefinger against the far edges of her painted eyebrows and the top of her lip. They look at this golden triangle, right here, and identify you. That's why I've got more noses than a coke fiend. Welcome to the fugitive world. No eyebrows, no real hair, no natural nose. Page 252. Villainous Aspirations. Huh. Danny had been wondering why Frank's avatar didn't look more like Humphrey Bogart, and she'd just given him the explanation. Frank had got the bits right that he thought were important, the nose and eyes, but not the parts outside the golden triangle, the full lips, the jaw, or the hairline. He probably thought he already looked like Bogart, and in computer terms he did, it just didn't work that way for humans. He took in her coat and boots, her need for disguise. "Are you going out?" "I haven't had time to myself for ages. Too many days spent watching you. I thought I might pretend to be an American tourist, visit St. Paul's, tea at Claridge's, that kind of thing." "What about us, what about the plan?" Angela hadn't needed convincing about Frank's weakness, his Achilles heel for Sharon. When Danny had rushed back to the apartment last night to tell her, she'd seen it straight away. "There's not much I can do, is there?" she said. "You're seeing your friend Eric at lunchtime, and Sharon a while later. One of the skills of management is knowing when to not get in the way. But I'm relying on you to sort out the internet connection. We'll need big bandwidth, Major League." Page 253. Villainous Aspirations. "No problem. Moorhen has its own router at Telehouse. How did you get one in there?" "Lots of companies do. It's a regular commercial deal, nothing special." This was good news. Telehouse was at the heart of the UK's internet system, the biggest centre for internet traffic in the country, an anonymous and little-known building in Docklands, the ideal venue for an unseen war. The war they were about to fight would be a digital war for the world's computer systems, an arcade game gone out of control, a huge battle fought inside servers and routers and optical fibers and copper wires, all hidden away from the regular world. One more step in the direction that mankind's wars had always been heading, more technical, less personal, high-altitude bombers taking over from spears and swords, then missiles launched from the other side of the world, pilotless planes, weapons officers in ships and silos tapping keyboards and praying their electronics outperformed the other side's. The battle they were about to fight merely took this progression to its next logical stage. It would be purely electronic warfare, software versus software, a virtual war fought inside microchips and motherboards, without all the. Page 254. Villainous Aspirations. Messy physical business of missiles and bullets, just one program against another, and fought for purely electronic territory, for control of a virtual world, because whoever had control of that world also had control of the real one. There would be an added bonus when this war was won. Danny would be able to sleep in his own bed again. Eric lived in Hackney, a similar district to Islington but with less money. His block of flats was relatively modern, an ugly 1960s building squeezed between surviving Victorian terraces, built in the space created by one of Hitler's bombs, but the inside was beautiful. The furniture was mainly chrome, green canvas, and glass, not to Danny's taste but so well coordinated he had to appreciate it. This was a room that had been put together with thought and attention to detail. Everything was immaculate, from the position of the green cushions on the sofa to the angles of the magazines on the coffee table. "I really have to thank you for that warning," said Eric. "That's okay," said Danny. "I'm not sure what you're working on right now, arms, legs." Page 255. Villainous Aspirations. Toes, fingers, but whatever it is, if you'd gone to hospital you'd probably have lost one. There was no evidence of Eric's profession in the lounge. Plenty of high-tech blended in with the decor, a white widescreen TV and DVD player with home cinema speakers, a sub-notebook and scanner, but there were no bits of robotic bodies lying around. Danny still hadn't seen any confirmation that Eric was the expert he claimed to be, apart from his easy understanding of Frank. Eric paled. "I need a drink." "Fancy one?" Danny shook his head. It was lunchtime and he had a lot to do today. "Let's move on," said Eric. "What can I do for you?" He walked across to the far end of the lounge, where there was a small refrigerator, like a hotel minibar, hidden by a draped tablecloth. Danny wasn't quite ready to make his request. "Almost ready," but he needed a few lines of preamble to get himself in the flow. "Are you still against Frank?" Eric laughed. "Is that a joke? Have you any idea what he nearly did to me?" He stood, holding a glass of white wine. "You know he's become the planet's dominant species, don't you?" Page 256. Villainous Aspirations. The same thought had occurred to Danny. He'd said it to Angela when he'd seen the articles and mails about researchers missing limbs, then realized later what he'd said. Yes. The species that controls the most resources, the one that determines what resources are available to other species. That was us, humans, until Frank came along. But now he's got control over almost all our computers, and we rely on computers, don't we? But he's still dependent on us. He can't survive without humans. We could easily survive without him. Eric sat on the sofa. He held his wine glass very delicately, by the stem, and sipped at the contents. The grip was in such contrast to the way he'd held his beer glass in the pub that Danny couldn't help but stare. "That's right," said Eric. "He needs our electricity, our microchips, our repairmen to fix his computers. But how many of us does he need? A few hundred. What about the other 6 billion? And this is all before he gets mobility. Once he's developed arms and legs, how many of us will he need then? Ever heard of the V-Ultra Kip?" Independently, Eric appeared to have reached the same conclusion as Angela, that. Page 257. Villainous Aspirations. Frank wanted autonomy. But had he arrived at that same time scale? How many days before all this comes together? Eric looked at his watch. 11 hours and 37 minutes. That didn't sound like a guess. Danny could come back to the precision later, but right now he should cut to the chase. It sounded like he had a lot less time than he'd thought. "You create robotic arms and legs, right? Something like that. Do you do custom work?" "Mostly." "What are the chances you could create a robotic male sex organ in less than 12 hours? He'd asked Angela almost the same question, though with a longer time scale, and she'd replied, "You burned down my factory." She'd said it in the same tone she might use to point out a distinctive birthmark or a constellation in the sky. "Not without a factory, I can't." Eric's eyes opened wide. What? Damn, thought Danny, and this had seemed his best chance. "I thought you might be able to build a prosthetic penis." Page 258. Villainous Aspirations. Eric was clearly shocked. He rolled the remainder of his wine around his glass for a while, then swallowed it, scowling as the cold hit his sore tooth. "You'd better take a look in the back. I need to show you something." Behind the lounge was a kitchen, pure white paint and wood, belonging to a French farmhouse, and just as neat and tidy as the lounge. A short corridor led from there to the back of the flat. On the way they passed 2 open doors, one leading into a glorious bathroom, deep blue with low-level lighting, and the other into Eric's bedroom. Eric closed the bedroom door as he went past, but Danny thought he saw a glimpse of black satin on a double bed, though he couldn't be sure. And he could smell perfume. "You live here alone, Eric?" "Yeah." Eric unlocked the door at the end of the corridor. His workshop was almost the same size as the lounge, and better lit by floor-to-ceiling windows. One of the walls was unfaced brick, decorated with tools and with unfinished items of work, with hands and feet, some showing their mechanical innards and others covered with latex skin, looking far too lifelike and grotesque. There were more on the work benches, some held fast in vices, and 3 long red items that Danny. Page 259. Villainous Aspirations. Imagined might be tongues, although they looked too large. Eric too, realized Danny, was a dealer-supplier in the world of technology junkies. Cook the spoon and take another hit in the shooting gallery of progress. Like Angela, Eric had never asked why Frank had been created, and he never would. Frank had been created because he could be created, and that was sufficient reason. One mountaineer doesn't have to ask another why they climb mountains. I specialize in small joint movement and skin sensitivity, explained Eric. No knees, elbows, hips, shoulders, just the detailed stuff. Everybody's got to be a specialist these days. Me too, agreed Danny. I do process control for ion implantation. Problem is, I haven't got much in the way of qualifications, so I don't get a lot of business from the corporates and universities. I'm in the gray area. What do you mean? People with a shotgun round in the foot, a hand taken off with a machete. Everything I do is legal, maybe because the law hasn't caught up yet, but I can't say the same for my clients. Page 260. Villainous Aspirations. The end of the room furthest from the windows was curtained off. Eric drew the curtain back. What do you think? There were no hands and feet here. On the wall and workbench were at least 50 human sex organs of different colors, sizes, and sexes. Bloody difficult, I can tell you, said Eric. Most bits of the body stay the same shape and sensitivity all day. But not these, oh no. Can you imagine designing a clitoris? Sometimes it likes a direct touch, sometimes it doesn't. How do I work out when? Pricks aren't much easier. Early sensitivity near the top of the shaft, late sensitivity in the glands. Nobody can do a proper erection mechanism, me neither, but then not many people try. I get most of my money from this end of the business. The mainstream robotics companies leave it alone. Once he'd got over the shock, Danny was pleased to see this display of prosthetic sexuality. He'd obviously come to the right place. Generally the first use of technology, sex, continued Eric. Always a high priority for the human race. How long after the phone was invented before somebody used it to say, the idiot's out for the evening, fancy coming over for a shag? How long after cars were invented before some horny couple hopped in the back? Page 261. Villainous Aspirations. Got no diseases, these, either, always take care of their hygiene. You know what I mean. Can we adapt one of these for Frank? Asked Danny. The man with no dick and no body. Eric picked up a device from the workbench. It was a phallus mounted on a long mechanized arm, looking like a fetish anglepoise lamp. It came with a neatly coiled electricity lead and control wire. Nearly finished. How far off? Eric looked at his watch again. A lot less than 11 hours. Then Danny had the first of two realizations. You were already working on this for Frank. Eric nodded. That's what he was pressuring me about. On a deadline. Midnight tonight. But how was he? The penises were all very lifelike, except none of them were flaccid. But some of the vaginas were most peculiar, very round, without labia, and made for thighs that were far too close together. Unless they were. And in that instant, something else slipped into place. The overdone macho image at page 262. Villainous Aspirations. The bar, a delicate grip on a wine glass, the immaculate hair and tidiness, the fine taste in furniture, the black satin that he really had seen, the heady perfume that didn't belong to a man, or at least not a hetero man. That's right, said Eric, watching the realization cross Danny's face. That's my big secret. Nobody knows. Especially not at the pub. I like to keep it that way. Except Frank. That's right. The bastard. How does he know? He looked at my emails. Danny wondered why he'd been let in on the secret. Because of Frank, no doubt, but more than anything else because of the night at Moorhen. Though they barely knew each other, they already had a trauma in common and a shared secret. Now they had one more. I think I need to go now. Don't like gays. No, it's not that. I'm meeting Sharon. Well, I don't like most of 'em. Real mixed bag like everybody else. Can't stand the theatricals. That's why I spend most of my time with straights. Really, it's not that. Page 263. Villainous Aspirations. How about natural selection and homosexuality? There's something else to fill your head with. Genetic dead end. You wonder how many of us there'd be if we procreated. Got to start from scratch, every generation. Roll on cloning. Eric, calm down. I haven't got a problem, I've just got a lot to do today, that's all. Eric did manage to calm down. He stroked the tip of the phallus. Best piece of work I've ever done, and for the worst client. It's perfect, Eric, just perfect. Can you bring it to the place I'm staying, late this afternoon? Here's the address. Chapter 19. Sharon was often late, but not this time. She turned up at 2 o'clock precisely, where the New River Walk started on Cannonberry Road, a mile north of their home, the one Danny hadn't been able to live in for a while. I wasn't sure you meant here, she said, breathlessly. You could have been outside the public library on Dover Road, at the start of Astis Row. That's New River too, in a way. Shut up. Come here. Danny wrapped his arms around her without ceremony and page 264. Villainous Aspirations. Hugged her close, smelling her skin, her hair, thinking that maybe he should forget about everything else and go home. But there was no long-term future in that, not until the plan had gone through and the business of Frank had been dealt with. God, I've missed you, said Sharon. I know exactly how that feels. Danny realized he was squeezing too hard and eased off. They stayed glued together for a long time. He didn't look at her directly until his eyes cleared. Do I get to find out what's going on? She asked. Of course, sweetheart. But first, how's Danielle? She's better. They walked through the iron gate to begin the half-mile ribbon of trees, grass, and water that formed New River Walk, following the route of the first man-made watercourse to bring fresh drinking water to the City of London, in 1613. Apart from the mouth of the Regent's Canal Tunnel, this was the only place in Islington where tall trees were found next to water. To compensate, in some perverse way, for its beautiful streets of Georgian houses, Islington had very few parks. Mankind had taken over all available space for its dwellings and the private. Page 265. Villainous Aspirations. Gardens that went with them. At least this public park, small and thin as it was very pretty. Did you get her disconnected? Yes. The man responsible for the New River scheme featured in one of the paintings on Danny's dining room walls. He was the companion of the gentleman that Lewis had pointed out in the Hogarth painting, the man sharing a pipe with Sir Walter Raleigh, Sir Hugh Middleton, whose statue also adorned Islington Green. The watercourse itself was still there, on their left, restored, a little artificial, around 10 feet wide and originally 4 feet deep, now more like 2. 2 feet deep was shallow enough for Danny to cope with. 4 feet would have been too much. Sharon had made sure the first time they walked this route was at the end of winter, when the water was clear for its entire length and he'd been able to see the shallow bottom. Now it didn't matter if it became cloudy or covered in algae, he had a mental map to recall that it was safe. And did Dr. Russell put up much of a fight? Surprisingly, no. She said that what was happening to Danielle was irrational, defied. Page 266. Villainous Aspirations. Common sense, and if I'd sign the consent form she'd be happy to try disconnecting her, but she couldn't do it without. Wise doctor. Within 2 hours, Danielle was off the danger list. She might even wake up today. They passed the ancient watchman's hut with the waterway curving around it. Clean water was a precious commodity back in the 17th century, and often stolen. Water poachers gave rise to water gamekeepers. The hut was tiny and round, with bulbous walls like a boletus mushroom, and a peaked roof with a bauble on top, much like a reclining breast. "So what is going on?" asked Sharon. As they walked, hand in hand, Danny explained about the creation of Frank, his involvement, their falling out, the consequences. He mentioned how Frank could intercept calls and trace a mobile's location, and talked of Lewis, the get-out-of-jail card. He didn't mention the fire at Moorhen or his visit to Eric's flat, at least for now. Sharon turned. They hugged again. "I feel foolish," she said. "I had no idea about all this. I knew something was going on, but not how important it was." Page 267. Villainous Aspirations. There's no reason to feel foolish. It was my mistake, not telling you. But yesterday, when you came back, I was there with your enemy. You didn't know who he was. It still doesn't feel good." They started walking again. The trees were lovely. Willows and gum trees, others that Sharon could probably name but Danny didn't recognize. The watercourse itself was best ignored. In this section the water was the color of tea, with milk. It was there purely for ornamentation and didn't appear to flow. Half a dozen mallards scooted around, oblivious to the color. Later in summer, the still water would turn green with algae, and the mallards waddled awkwardly out of it with brilliant green bellies. In winter it would freeze over, by then the mallards had gone elsewhere and blue-gray pigeons tiptoed over the meager ice, picking at whatever had fallen from the trees, flapping their wings furiously when the frozen water broke beneath their feet. "So where did you stay last night?" "I been adopted by a very interesting American lady who's also keen on destroying Frank. Her name's Angela." Page 268. Villainous Aspirations. Sharon stopped. "Angela." Then she carried on walking again, but didn't look at Danny directly for a while. "Do you know her?" "No." "Oh. It sounded like. Or maybe it didn't. This wasn't a time to find ghosts and shadows." Danny explained about Angela and her place in the scheme of things, without the spy in the spire part, the weird camera, and realized as he talked about her how little he knew himself, not that Sharon seemed bothered by the many omissions. After a while, she said, "You remember we talked about whether sex with a robot was infidelity?" "Of course. And I said it depends on whether the robot seems to be human. If it is, that's infidelity. If it isn't, it's not." "Forget it." "Really, forget it?" "I overreacted." Frank recited erotic poetry. "Clever bastard." "I'm sorry." She drew her arm around his waist. "It's all very confusing. I thought it didn't matter with something that's so obviously a machine. But it does. I won't do it again." Page 269. Villainous Aspirations. Danny knew this day would be difficult, but it was getting harder by the minute. At the end of the first section they crossed Willow Bridge Road and came to the most beautiful section of the walk. Here the thin green oasis squeezed between rows of houses widened out a little, or at least appeared to. The water was clear, the willows were bigger and mixed with enormous chestnut trees, with their dazzling displays of white flowers in upright cones, 4 inches wide and 6 high, turning the mass of leaves into giant flower beads. The weather was agreeable, crisp white clouds with plenty of blue between them. "You remember something else you said?" began Danny. "Your fantasy. You said you'd like to make love to somebody else while I watched." "I blew that." "Forget it. Anyway, you hated the idea. At the time." He waited for her to follow up that invitation. She didn't. "It's important to me," he said. There was going to be no right time to say this. He'd have blurted it out and deal with the outcome. A squirrel ran across their path, half tame, stopping in the middle of the tarmac and standing on its rear legs. Page 270. Villainous Aspirations. To see if it would be offered food by the slothful Bipts. I should have brought squirrel food, said Sharon. Fuck the squirrels. She frowned at him. That hadn't been the right thing to say. He needed to improve on that. He stopped and regarded the squirrel, still upright in its begging position. We're supposed to be the top species because we got up off the dirt and stood on our hind legs, and that freed up our hands to use tools. How long before we're caught up by squirrels, meerkats, and kangaroos? That was stupid, too. A reflection of what was swirling around in his own mind, not hers. Yet it seemed to half amuse her. There's something important I need to ask you, he said. It's going to sound pretty weird, but bear with me. Sharon's mobile rang. Oh, for Christ's sake! Yelled Danny. The interruption was doubly frustrating because Sharon didn't have a mobile. Yet she went through all the motions of having one, digging it out of her handbag, pressing the answer button and saying hello. Page 271. Villainous Aspirations. She listened for a few seconds, making eye contact with Danny from time to time. He had a moment of panic, but it passed quickly. If Frank or his goons were using this mobile that appeared to belong to Sharon to track him down, it was unlikely that they'd ring to let anybody know. How the hell did you get this number? Said Sharon, indignantly. The earpiece mumbled to itself. She lowered the phone without saying goodbye and pressed to end the call. Who was that? Asked Danny. The mobile phone shop, ringing to see if I want an upgrade. I can't believe it. I only bought the damn thing an hour ago. I thought you hated mobiles. I do. You know, you really should have switched it off. I mentioned how Frank tracks mobiles. Why didn't you tell me about it? It's brand new. Anybody looking for me will know who you are. It's a pay-as-you-go. They could still track you down from the credit card payment. Page 272. Villainous Aspirations. Darling, I may not be technical, but I'm not stupid. I paid cash. Is cash okay? I wanted to be careful. I thought it might make a nice present for a fugitive. Danny stopped. The chestnut trees were behind them now and the view was less pretty. You mean, you bought it for me? At least that way I could call you, from work or a call box. I'd get to hear your voice. That would be nice. Great. A thoughtful present, a very thoughtful present, shopped for with care and attention to detail, and he just had a go at her about it. This was all working out just peachy. You had something important to tell me, said Sharon. The seconds passed. Later. Stop shuffling your feet and say it. This really isn't a good time. I'm asking. Danny breathed out heavily and collected himself. Okay. It's about your fantasy, the one I shouldn't have asked you about. And there was a rat, a big brown one, coming out of the shallow bank of the unmoving New River and across the grass to the housing estate on Danny's right. Best ignored. He forcibly. Page 273. Villainous Aspirations. Stopped his eyes tracking it. I'd like to make it real for you, I really would. While I watch, I'd like you to sleep with Frank. What? You want me to sleep with a machine that's been trying to harm you, trying to kill my sister, that it turns out you built, that I had some, I don't know, mild flirtation with, that I now regret. Darling, I don't. I would never have mentioned this if it didn't fit your fantasy. I promise. You understand? No, not really. You're trying to manipulate me for some reason. I can hear it. That's bullshit. The only reason I'm not giving you hell is because I asked the question, so I have to deal with the answer. That was harsher, also intuitive, and correct. Danny knew his last line had been a mistake. What you say is true. I admit it. I'll explain it all to you in a moment. The outcome I want, that's for both of us, is why I asked, and you can judge for yourself if it's worthwhile. That came out clumsily, but at least it was truthful. It's the only way we can deal with Frank, get him off our backs. My back, maybe that's the wrong expression. I've got a plan. Just listen to it and see what you think, please. Page 274. Villainous Aspirations. Of course I'll listen. Then I'll tell you there's absolutely no chance of me sleeping with a machine that persecutes my lover and tries to kill my sister. So why waste your time? Sharon started walking again, rapidly, and she didn't take Danny's hand. Anyway, isn't this all a bit academic? Frank is a machine, the inside a computer. How the hell do you expect me to have sex with a computer? We're working on that. Oh, thank you. Sharon stamped the ground and made a noise in her throat like she was trying to shift a chicken bone. She turned and lodged her head over his shoulder, gripping his chest so hard it cleared the breath from his lungs. The anger in her voice gave way to a pleading sadness. Oh Danny. I hate you being away. I can't stand it. When are you coming home? She began to sob, in her strange staccato way, very slowly, unbelievably slowly, like she'd turned the very timing of it into an art form. She had an unusual style of crying, hardly ever full on but instead sporadic and suppressed, the way most people cry when they've got over the worst of the upset and are in the process of recovery, with deep sobs separated by silences. That was how Sharon started out when she cried. Page 275. Villainous Aspirations. And then when she began to recover she stopped altogether. It was like hiccups in a way, and meant she could go about other business while still crying, if she wanted to, because it didn't wholly get in the way. Danny adjusted to the python grip and hugged her again, not tired by the repeated occasions, enjoying them, relishing them, wishing they could be frozen in time and enjoyed forever. Of all the poems he knew, there was one that came to mind for a moment this sentimental. Slowly, quietly, he floated the words into Sharon's ear. Say, do the elm clumps greatly stand still, guardians of that holy land? The chestnuts shade, in reverent dream, the yet unacademic stream. Is dawn a secret shy and cold? Anadyomony, silver gold. And sunset still a golden sea. From hassling field to Matingly. And after, ere the night is born, do hares come out about the corn? Oh, is the water sweet and cool, gentle and brown, above the pool? And laughs the immortal river still, under the mill, under the mill? Page 276. Villainous Aspirations. Say, is there beauty yet to find? And certainty? And quiet kind? Deep meadows yet, for to forget the lies, and truths, and pain? Oh! Yet stands the church clock at 10 to 3? And is there honey still for tea? Sharon stopped sobbing halfway through. She drew back slightly to look at Danny. Her eyes and cheeks were still wet, but she was smiling. Plenty of honey. No milk, I'm afraid, but yes, plenty of honey. And she laughed, for the first time that afternoon, but not in any pleasant way that Danny hoped to hear again. Chapter 20. Angela walked around Eric's masterpiece, now standing on the coffee table in the middle of her lounge, lit by the arched windows. Not bad at all, Eric. That should do just fine. For the journey from his home to Angela's apartment, Eric had covered the item in brown paper, as any decent pornographic item should be wrapped. Under his arm, it had looked like a designer lamp, but with the covering removed it resembled a miniature mechanical. Page 277. Villainous Aspirations. Roadbreaker. The paper rustled beneath Angela's feet as she walked, and went silent as she paused to touch the phallus on its shaft. Just one or two things, she said. The surface texture could be softer, and it's cold. Is there a heating element? Eric shook his head. We can use a section of my electric blanket, suggested Angela, then add a flat screen as the outer layer, the touch-sensitive kind. It'll work perfectly well, I've done it before. Danny can give you a hand sorting out the connectors. I really don't see why we're wasting our time, said Danny, sulkily, from his raised but distant position sitting on the steps that led up to the kitchen. I've already told you that Sharon said no. Without Sharon, there's no point to this. And I've already told you that she'll change her mind, once I've talked to her, replied Angela. I've known her for 5 years and I'm her lover, but I can't convince her. You're going to meet her for the first time and after 5 minutes have her doing something she won't do for me? I don't see it. You will, replied Angela, with the same casual confidence she'd shown all along. Page 278. Villainous Aspirations. In Danny's mind the entire plan was now dead in the water. Sharon had said no, and that was the end of it. In a way, he was happy that she'd said no, emotionally, if not rationally. But when he'd given the news to Angela, she hadn't been fazed in the least. When she calls you on that new mobile, she'd said, let me talk to her for a moment, invite her here for a chat. I'm sure she'll say yes. Angela passed him twice as she went upstairs and came down again with her electric blanket, ignoring him on both occasions. She sat on the lounge floor with Eric, like two children in art class. Using a pair of scissors, pliers, and electrical tape, the pair somehow managed to fashion a cylindrical cap of blanket material to fit loosely over Eric's sculpture, a loose tweedy coat, a furry condom. When the cap was in place, Eric began sewing, pinching the blanket material and stitching lengths of it together in ridges up and down the shaft, bringing it tight against the underlying form. It's going to be too wide, said Danny. No it won't, said Angela. I don't see why it needs to be warm in the first place. Nothing worse than a cold dildo. Page 279. Villainous Aspirations. A conspiratorial smile passed between Angela and Eric. Danny had anticipated they might get on well, an intelligent woman and a gay man were always a good bet, but not to this extent, where he felt excluded. Is this supposed to be circumcised or uncircumcised? Asked Angela. She was blonde today, with a bob cut, pale eyebrows, straight nose. It was like knowing a whole group of different women with the same voice and attitudes, except you never got to see them at the same time. Not that Danny was sure he would want to meet an entire crowd of Angelas. For God's sake, he muttered. The action is circumcised, answered Eric. No sheath mechanism from a foreskin, more friction. But my bet is that Frank will want the feeling of a foreskin. He glanced at Angela. I see what you mean. It needs the horseshoe ridges of a Freenar band, about halfway down, rather than an annular scar. Exactly, said Angela. In contrast to Angela, Eric looked precisely the same as when Danny had last seen him. Black clothes again, pristine, and his hair exactly the same length. How did he do that? Page 280. Villainous Aspirations. Eric, just sew it together, will you? Demanded Danny. This isn't an embroidery contest. The ridges on a circumcised penis are in a different place to the ridges on an uncircumcised one, explained Eric. There's science in dildos too, you know. He was definitely acting camp, decided Danny, the way he let go of the needle to wave an explanatory hand around. I'm sure there is, but not one I'm interested in learning. Eric sniffed. I think we're about ready to add the screen. Angela had brought a small screen with her when she'd come downstairs with the electric blanket, and like any flat screen it wasn't inherently flat, when peeled away from its backing it was perfectly flexible. Gingerly, Eric rolled the pliable screen around the phallus and held it in place with carpet tape. Eric, said Angela, that looks desperate. With the silver carpet tape in place and many messy folds and a gap at the tip, the phallus did look distinctly unattractive. This is just a fitting, replied Eric. I'll use glue in a moment. But while it's held. Page 281. Villainous Aspirations. Together, let's try switching on the heater, see how the screen copes. It took a few seconds for the surface of the phallus to heat up. Angela grasped it in her palm, thumb not quite reaching forefinger. Temperature's right, but now it's a little too soft. We need more tension. Eric's hand took her place. You're right. Too soft. The difference between Eric's attention to the phallus and Angela's was marked. Eric was a handmaiden dressing the bride on the morning before her wedding, very delicate and respectful. Angela was altogether more sinister. In her long cardigan, and with the Gothic windows of the church behind her, she looked like the priestess of a strange cult, preparing an offering for sacrifice. Danny wandered down from the steps and placed the back of his hand against the middle of the shaft. Too hot, otherwise perfect. Eric began to snigger. What's wrong? Asked Danny. Angela held her hand in front of her mouth, eyes sparkling. How the hell can you tell, using the back of your hand? When did anybody ever hold a penis like that, for Christ's sakes? Get a grip on the thing. Page 282. Villainous Aspirations. Danny's hand faltered, but stayed in place. I don't want to. It's far too hot, and I can't understand what you mean about being too soft. It's perfectly hard enough. Angela sighed and managed to lose her smile. Eric, how many erect penises have you felt? Dunno. 30, 35. And I've managed, 18, 20. How about you, Danny? Danny didn't answer. 1. Look, I admit that I'm not the expert here. And that between us we've got 50 times your experience, but you're still right. Right? The temperature is perfect. It should feel hot. But it's not firm enough. Eric, try pulling the edges together and retaping. Eric gently peeled the tape back and adjusted the tension. It's still too wide, said Danny. You couldn't even get your thumb and forefinger around it? Angela reached out to grasp it. That's better. Nor would I want to. Almost, maybe, but not quite. Page 283. Villainous Aspirations. We're not trying to produce Elephant Man. Angela looked resignedly at Eric, then back at Danny. Tell me, Danny, what size is Frank's ego? Extra large. So he'll want a penis to go with that, won't he? But you just want to give him a tiny cold one that he'll turn down. Right. Danny didn't respond. Angela and Eric checked the firmness again, like chefs tasting seasoning. I think we ought to give it a name, said Angela, removing the authority from her voice, trying to restore harmony. It's a remarkable piece of engineering. It deserves to have a name. Eric peeled off the carpet tape and removed the screen, then began sewing thicker ridges into the blanket material. I've got one. The digital dildo. Danny was about to say that was a bloody awful name, but then he realized that Angela hadn't replied, and her silence was more devastating than anything he might say. Okay, maybe not, conceded Eric, quietly. I've got a suggestion, said Danny, feeling inspired and ready to contribute. He'd been thinking about Sharon again, about the page 284. Villainous Aspirations. Vibrator she'd mentioned from her college days. How about Frank's aspiration? Chapter 21. Angela understood Sharon far better than Danny imagined. When Sharon called him on his new mobile, and he eventually passed the machine over to Angela, the invitation was accepted within seconds. He met Sharon at the door when she arrived, half an hour later. They hugged, but it was a hug with an audience, so not entirely satisfactory. "This is Angela," he said. "And Eric." He didn't introduce Frank's aspiration. Eric was still making the final adjustments to the software, so the touch sensitivity of different sections of the screen changed over time. Danny had suggested it should be hidden away when Sharon arrived, but Angela said it wouldn't make any difference, and again she was right. Sharon must have recognized the purpose of the strange device, but she ignored it. Angela and Sharon shook hands. Danny watched this first meeting closely but found it difficult to read. They were very casual, like old. Page 285. Villainous Aspirations. Friends meeting in some kind of official capacity and obliged to go through the formality of a handshake, even though they'd had a quiet lunch together a few hours before. Either that or they instantly hated each other. It was hard to tell which, like seeing photographs of people crying and laughing and trying to work out one from the other. Certainly they didn't bother with much eye contact or small talk. "Right," said Angela. "Sharon and I need to discuss the world." That statement didn't inspire anybody to comment or action, so Angela added, "Danny, there's a electrician's screwdriver set in the steeple. Do you mind getting it for me?" Danny recalled his last visit to the steeple. The room was tiny and he'd looked at every item in there. "I don't remember seeing one. But the set definitely exists, at least in a virtual sense, and performs an essential function, even if it can't be seen. That's a classic virtual function, as any programmer would recognize." "Ah, you want me to leave the room? Oh, you can be so direct, you English. Whoa. Eric, stay where you are. You're nearly finished, I don't want you stopping now." Page 286. Villainous Aspirations. Danny looked at Sharon, who half smiled at him. Apart from mild discomfort, that smile held no message. "I'll shout when we're finished," said Angela, as he headed upstairs. "And don't tease the camera." It was the first thing he looked at as he entered the steeple room, and unless he was mistaken the eyes briefly turned to him, maybe seeing him in their peripheral vision or noticing a difference in brightness or shade. Then they returned to their vigil of his home. He looked down the line of sight of the binoculars held by the hand, looked down at his own front door, with Ronnie on sentry duty and Bradley resting in the blue Lexus a few yards away. As instructed, he didn't tease the camera, and after a while he felt comfortable with it. It was a presence in the room, something partially alive, but as benign as a cat watching the outside world from a windowsill. Circumstances were slightly more relaxed than last time he'd been here. With no threat of a maniac appearing from the bathroom below, he found the room had an entirely different dynamic. It was observatory, a thinking room. Page 287. Villainous Aspirations. With a panoramic view of the world, but isolated from its dangers and troubles. Through the windows he counted cranes, tall construction cranes, some with a fixed horizontal jib and others with an angled version. He could see 18. Some bright pundit had once said the health of London's economy could be read from counting cranes, or at least the health of its property market, but since Danny hadn't counted before he had no way of knowing whether 18 was high or low. He counted church spires too, 14 of them in this relatively low-rise landscape. The nearest were just a few hundred yards south, a very muted pair of peaks on the Polish church at the far end of Devonia Road, the one with an unpronounceable name beginning CZ. The second nearest were on Duncan Terrace, close to Upper Street, two lurid green peaks above the Catholic Church of St. John the Evangelist, built for the Irish navvies who'd lived around here while they dug Regent's Canal and its half-mile tunnel beneath Islington, and who then decided to settle. The canal itself couldn't be seen from the steeple, but the lines of tall trees on either side of it, close to the tunnel mouth, were clearly visible beyond the Polish church. That towpath walk. Page 288. Villainous Aspirations. Area was a no-go zone for Danny, the water was way too deep for him to be near. Beyond St. John the Evangelist he could see the clock tower of King's Cross, and the tall Gothic masterpiece of St. Pancras Station, evidence of eras, the canal era, and the railway era close behind it. King's Cross, its goods yard and its tracks, had arrived just 30 years after Regent's Canal was completed, taking the transport of coal and other important materials away from the canal and symbolically turning it into a commercial failure. Down below the spire, on St. Peter's Street, was evidence of an even later era, one that had eventually turned the railways into loss-makers too, Bradley's Lexus, or whoever it belonged to, and the vehicles moving on the street and grinding their skirts on the speed bumps, the era of the private motor car. Yet the digital era, the recent revolution of ones and zeros, was barely visible outside the cramped space of the steeple. It was manifest inside, with the strange camera and 3 computers burning their dust barbecues, 2 of them without cabinets, open to collect more fuel. But outside, a couple of mobile phone arrays only hinted at it, one on top of Islington Green School, one above a tall block of flats. A time traveler arriving from the 1970s. Page 289. Villainous Aspirations. Wouldn't have popped out of their craft and looked around and said, "Wow! Look at that! You've had a digital revolution." At least not until they'd peered through an office window at a computer, or seen their first mobile phone. Electricity, there was another hidden revolution. Danny scanned the cityscape for evidence of electricity. He could see a big substation near City Road, concealed in an anonymous gray building. You had to know about that one to see it. Down on St. Peter's Street all the electricity cables were buried in accordance with the rules for a Grade 2 conservation area. Electricity was nowhere to be seen, apart from in the streetlights, flickering on to show their presence, one by one. The canal and railway revolutions had left their permanent marks. The revolution of the private motor car even more so, with its flat blue robot tracks spread around like horizontal cobwebs. The revolution of electricity was hidden in the day, though it would be impossible to miss at night, a vampire energy, half hidden, half obvious. Only the digital revolution was more secretive. 2 more eras were clear from this vantage point: the television, showing itself in the forest of aerials on rooftops, pointing south. Page 290. Villainous Aspirations. Towards the mast at Crystal Palace like spiny compass needle tails, and in the sky, the era of mass air travel, aircraft curving in on their long approach to Heathrow, the world's busiest international airport, 20 miles west, queuing in the sky for touchdown, 10 or 12 of them visible at one time. 3,000 or 4,000 people were up there right now, the population of a village, waiting for their turn to reach the ground. All these eras, these revolutions of transport and communications, had once lined up in a similar way to the approaching aircraft, but in time rather than space. The canals, electricity, railways, roads, television, mobile phones, the invisible digital revolution, all had waited there in line in a 4th dimension, in time, becoming more and more inevitable until eventually they made their final approaches and touched down, one by one, to change the world, irreversibly, to change the way people communicated, learned, met lovers, moved their bodies and their goods from one location to another, how they raised their children, how they lived and died. Right now, a plane called artificial intelligence was on its final approach in this 4th dimension, barely seen from the ground, destined inevitably to land at some point. All he. Page 291. Villainous Aspirations. And Angela were trying to do was scare the plane off the tarmac on its first approach, as its wheels made first contact, forcing it to make one more circuit, maybe in the hope that it would make a better approach next time, or that humanity could at least prepare for its arrival. A tapping sound brought him out of his daydream. At first he couldn't tell where it came from, then he noticed the hand of the bizarre camera banging its binoculars on the wooden base. A malfunction? He looked out of the window and saw Bradley and Ronnie staring up at him, not at somewhere close to him but at exactly where he was. Surely they couldn't see him. Given the distance and the size of the window, that would be a miracle. Also it was getting dark. If he hadn't known who the pair were, he wouldn't have been able to make them out in the twilight. And he hadn't switched a light on. No, it would be impossible for them to see him inside this dark room, yet they gave every indication that they could. They looked at each other and set off at a run. He tracked them, first through this window, then through the one to its left as they ran into Devonia Road, and into the entrance of the church. Page 292. Villainous Aspirations. He was down the steps in seconds, missing many of them in the rush, almost tumbling down the last set into the lounge, so quick the others immediately knew something was wrong. "Bradley," he said, breathlessly. "And Ronnie, headed this way." "Right," said Angela. "Action stations. Everybody upstairs. Danny will show you the way." "What about this?" said Eric, pointing at Frank's aspiration. "No time. Let's just hope it distracts them." Danny headed back up the stairs again. By the time he made it to the bathroom, he could already hear Ronnie fiddling with the lock of the apartment door, like a metallic mouse building a nest inside the tumbler. This was going to be close. The aluminium steps for the top room were still down. He ushered Eric and Sharon up, taking care not to touch Eric and equal care to touch Sharon, who looked even less happy than when she'd first arrived. Angela closed the bathroom door and signaled for Danny to go up before her. He reckoned there would be just enough space for all four of them in the narrow steeple. Unfortunately, he hadn't thought about the page 293. Villainous Aspirations. Process of getting everybody inside. When Angela arrived, there was nowhere for her to stand. There would be space once the ladder and trapdoor were tucked back in their resting position, but right now there was none. Angela realized this as she reached the top of the ladder. "Fuck," she whispered. With no time for niceties, she placed her feet on top of Danny's and hung off his arm, which was braced against the opposite wall. "Eric, lift the steps and the door will come up." Eric did as he was asked and the trapdoor began to close. Angela, to Danny's relief, placed her feet back on the closed trapdoor, making no noise. They could hear the traffic outside on St. Peter's Street, and their own breathing. Sharon had her arms tight around Danny, Angela still gripped his arm, but lightly. Eric was doing a good job of making himself as small as possible, so he didn't touch anybody. Below them they heard the bathroom door burst open, immediately followed by a loud banging on the trapdoor. "Ali Ali in!" yelled Bradley. "Come on out, you fucker. Uncle Bradley knows where you are." Chapter 22. Page 294. Villainous Aspirations. Nobody moved. "Let me tell you a bedtime story," began Bradley, yelling through the floor. "Me and Ron. We're out on the street, kicking our heels, and we're next to this big church and it's starting to get dark and all the lights are coming on in all the pretty windows. And Ron looks up and says," and for this part Bradley put on a perfect South African accent, "Bradley, when did you last see a church spire with windows? Only small windows, mind, but we starts thinking, how come we didn't see these windows when we was inside? Then we starts thinking, American bird, load of wigs, plenty of computers, hold on a minute. Then we gets inside again and there's this hydraulic dick sitting in the middle of the fucking floor minding its own business, like you get to see in all the posh fucker houses round. Bradley literally hammered his point home, this time using the business end of Percy when before he must have used the handle, and hitting so hard the movement jarred Danny's feet. "Open the fucking door and get your arses down here. 'Cause if I have to come up and get you, somebody's gonna get a spanking." Page 295. Villainous Aspirations. Angela nodded resignedly. Danny braced his arm again and she put her feet on top of his while Eric fiddled with the trapdoor and persuaded it to open. Angela came down the steps first, followed by Danny, then Sharon, and finally Eric. "Cor, look at this lot, Ron. I must have hit the bell and got the jackpot." "Eric, you fucker, what you doin' with the screw?" Eric didn't reply. Maybe he felt that whatever answer he gave would be wrong. They carried on down to the lounge, with their captors at each end of the line, Ronnie at the front, Bradley at the rear. Frank's aspiration made a curious centerpiece for the lounge. Danny realized that anybody looking into the lit room from the darkness outside would be able to see it. He checked for curtains by the arched windows, but there were none. Angela barely seemed to notice that somebody else had taken control. When she arrived downstairs in the lounge, she dragged a computer projector out from beneath the coffee table and began to set it up. "And who the fuck are you?" Bradley asked her. Despite the words, his tone was oddly. Page 296. Villainous Aspirations. Respectful. He probably wasn't used to people ignoring him. "I'm Angela Mayberry." "Ah, what? That's a result. See, Ron, I told you this was the jackpot. We got a 30 grand bonus coming for the lanky one, and 15 for the Yank in disguise. And what you doing right now, Miss USA?" "I'm about to contact Dan so you can tell him your good news." "That's very nice of you," said Bradley. "But I got my mobile with me. Don't need no help. This way, you get to see him. Aren't you curious to know what he looks like?" Bradley didn't reply, nor did he try to stop Angela setting up the projector. Meanwhile, Danny tried to comfort Sharon. Her shoulders slouched and her eyes stared gloomily at the floor. He'd rarely seen her look this glum. He guessed that while he'd been up in the spire on his own, the discussion down below had been fierce. Angela seemed perfectly happy with the outcome, Sharon quite the opposite. "Angela," he demanded, "what did you say to Sharon?" Page 297. Villainous Aspirations. Angela continued with the wires and switches, now setting up a webcam while the projector warmed up. "Ask her." "I've agreed to do it," mumbled Sharon, with no enthusiasm, "if we get the chance." "Do what?" queried Bradley. Then Danny realized why Angela was being so casual with him, why she was working so fast on the cables. Of course. If they contacted Dan visually, he'd get to see Frank's aspiration. That was the original plan, and Bradley's arrival hadn't changed it, just brought things forward a little. He didn't know what to say to Sharon, whether he should say thank you or sorry or both, or even talk her out of it. She looked so sad. Certainly he intended to find out how Angela had been so persuasive. But right now his attention was taken by the sudden arrival of Frank's avatar on the projector screen. "Hello Sharon," said Frank, softly, over Angela's computer speakers. "And who's that with you? Please do introduce me." "I'm Angela Mayberry," said Angela, looking directly at the webcam. "Angela," said Frank. "What a pleasure to meet you. I've heard so much about you." "What?" Page 298. Villainous Aspirations. "Happened to your nose?" "Ah, you've been hiding, haven't you?" "Nice avatar," replied Angela. "Very sexy. Flattery is always welcome, though better from friends." "Yeah, Frank, listen," began Bradley, "I got the whole shebang here. Me and Ron was outside the church and we seen this room in the steeple." "Eric," said Frank, excitedly. "Is this my machine?" Eric stepped forward, even though that wasn't really necessary. "Yes." "And does it work? Does it have movement?" Eric picked up the joystick control he'd connected to Frank's aspiration, and gave a brief demonstration. "And sensation?" asked Frank, eagerly. We need a big connection to get sensation. We can't do that here. We got the whole fucking shootin' match for you, said Bradley, raising his voice. Danny, Angela, and a few more besides. That's very good, Bradley, well done. What you want me to do with them? Nothing. Page 299. Villainous Aspirations. What do you mean, nothing? Bradley, said Frank, adding a stern edge to his voice. I will pay you for your work. I will pay your bonuses, as we agreed. Now step to one side, please. We'll come back to your issues later. Bradley tensed himself to argue, then thought better of it. He scowled and moved away to stand with Ronnie by the front door. Frank couldn't take his eyes off his new toy. I'm very impressed, Eric. Half the world's robotics experts are working on parts for my body, all of them crying how they can't make the deadline. Yet here you are, hours early. It looks great. Though I guess it doesn't really matter what I think. What do you think, Sharon? Danny inhaled sharply, but succeeded in freezing his expression. Whatever Sharon said, he wasn't going to let his face change. She'd managed to lose her sad mood, or at least suppress it so she could play her role. She hesitated. I think it's quite artistic, as an erotic sculpture. It's very well done. The tiny fan inside Angela's laptop began to whir as the microprocessor inside heated up. Millions of computers around the world were probably heating up right now. I would very much like to show you how erotic. Page 300. Villainous Aspirations. It can be. Frank seemed to get himself into a virtual tangle, but came out of it again. There's a VPN junction box at, no, none of you have the knowledge for that. What time is it? Damn. Right, tomorrow morning, take it to the Inmarsat building at Old Street. Danny struggled to keep his expression frozen. Frank, the sum of hundreds of thousands of logical computers, was making as much rational sense as an adolescent with a hard-on. This was good news. By the door, he could see Bradley and Ronnie in earnest discussion. Bradley did not look happy. Ronnie's watch arm was going up and down like he had a yo-yo attached to the end. I think we can do better than that, said Angela, getting into the spirit of things and sounding sexy, like a woman from a TV. Chocolate advert. All you need is a fast connection, a direct link into a huge network. We've got a router at Telehouse, a Moorhen router. I could arrange everything, get this device and Danny and Eric inside, and Sharon of course. But she hadn't presented the idea perfectly. A little of Frank's stony rationality returned. I could arrange all that myself. Page 301. Villainous Aspirations. Angela walked towards Frank's aspiration, swinging her hips, playing the vamp. Sure you could. You could arrange security cards, find a couple of telehouse engineers, allow them time to get familiar with the connections of your anatomy and how to patch them into the network. Slowly she drew her forefinger across the top of Aspiration's helmet, over the lips where the seam of the screen separated. With great attention to detail, Eric had managed to fold the edges of the touch screen inside a cavity he'd carved along the body of the phallus, underneath, so there was nothing more than a thin seam. At the tip he'd let the seam separate a little, creating lips for the glands. It looked astonishingly lifelike, despite the monochrome gray, and, at least to Danny, still too large. Angela didn't look at Frank. She held her eyes steadily and admiringly on Aspiration. But how long would that take? Hours? Days? She moved her finger behind and beneath the glands, and gently tickled there. We could be at Telehouse in a half hour, all plugged in and ready to roll. Though I guess you might prefer to wait. Frank grunted, caught himself and turned the grunt into a cough, which might have been. Page 302. Villainous Aspirations. Comical coming from a virtual being without a throat or lungs, but nobody laughed. Yes, yes. He murmured. Much quicker, much the best plan. And louder, remembering that he had an audience, 30 minutes at Telehouse. And don't be late. His avatar disappeared. You fucker, complained Bradley, addressing the blank screen. His business hadn't been finished. Eric began preparing Frank's aspiration for transport. Angela busied herself with the projector and screen. Danny looked at Sharon, and saw the mask of somebody playing a role. He wanted to say something supportive, but at the same time he didn't want to disturb that mask. Nicely played, he said, quietly. By the doorway, Bradley had his mobile out, thumb poised over the buttons. Danny got there first. What do you think, Bradley? He pointed at Frank's aspiration. Is that something built for a man, or for a machine with a sex drive? Bradley folded his arms across his chest, mobile still in hand. Beneath his expensive suit, his fat biceps bulged. I remember what you said. Page 303. Villainous Aspirations. In the car. It didn't make no sense at the time. But maybe I was a bit hasty. The plane crash in Germany, the train crash in Japan, said Danny. That was Frank. He's killed hundreds of people, Bradley, innocent people. Is that the kind of being you like to work for? Is that the kind of thing you like to build? I remember something else you said in the car, that you built him, whatever. I made a mistake. Bradley gestured at Frank's aspiration. So what's your angle? You got this fucking manic robot causing chaos in the world, what you doing making a piece of kit so it can shag your old lady? Don't make no sense, does it? In Bradley's graphic terms, it did sound very peculiar, but Danny didn't want to go into the details. It didn't much matter what Bradley thought, now they had Frank's approval to go to Telehouse. He turned to walk away. Bradley pulled him back, held him by the neck with a single fat hand and pinned him against the book-lined wall. Unless it's a trap. Danny could breathe, even speak if he felt like it. Bradley's grip wasn't having its intended effect, but Danny felt like it might be good. Page 304. Villainous Aspirations. Politics to pretend it was. He duly struggled for breath when Bradley let go. I got myself a bad position here, said Bradley. Geezer, or whatever it is, heap of chips, owes me close on 50 grand. But I tell you something else, I got 6 gorgeous grandchildren. Fucking center of my little universe, they are. The anger in Bradley's voice was curiously mixed with the crackle of emotion, of love. This was no great surprise. Almost from the beginning, Danny had Bradley down as a family man. Even in his worst moments he'd never managed to come across as a complete psychopath. He certainly had an aggressive streak, but alongside it was too much humor, too much happiness. It was easy to imagine him as a doting father or grandfather, a huge gorilla delicately picking ticks from its cubs. And does Frank show respect for the way you feel about them? Asked Danny. How the fuck do you know about that? Danny didn't, but it was a reasonable guess. Frank might easily point out the frailty of small children, maybe mentioning one or two by name, nothing too overt since the pair of them were supposed to be on the same side, but just enough to keep Bradley off balance. Page 305. Villainous Aspirations. Frank sees love only as a weakness to be exploited, explained Danny, because he's a machine. Bradley nodded. I got this bad movie playin' in my head, see. Like, one of 'em comes up to me and says, Granddad, why is the world run by heartless machines? Fucking break my heart, that would. Like, I watched it happen, sat on my arse and watched it happen. You and the rest of the world, Bradley. Bradley grabbed Danny by the upper arm, very forcefully. Not this time. What do you mean? I mean, I don't give a shit if I don't get my money. Is that it? It's enough. Never know who's gonna be the winner, do we? Bradley looked at his mobile and put it in his pocket. Run along, son. You got a mistake to put right. Chapter 23. Telehouse was on the east side of the Docklands development area, east of Limehouse where Regent's Canal connected with the real docks that had once existed in Docklands, and east of the landmark Canary Wharf Tower. It was on page 306. Villainous Aspirations. Coriander Avenue, off Oregano Drive, streets named after the once thriving spice trade of the East India Docks, or possibly by a group of town planners after a long Friday lunch. With all these dock and wharf connections, Danny was frightened they might suddenly come across an expanse of deep water, and he readied himself to yell stop, at first sight of it. He'd have been less worried if Sharon was driving, but although they'd taken Miss Daisy, it was Eric behind the wheel. Sharon had said she wasn't in the mood for driving, and nobody could argue with that. As they entered Coriander Avenue, Sharon yelled, "Eyes left, Danny. There's water on the right." They came to a gatehouse with barriers. The guard wasn't impressed by Sharon's beaten-up car. He double-checked Angela's security pass and asked her some half-technical questions about her company's installation, then let them through. Telehouse itself was stark and grey, and really a collection of 3 modern buildings rather than a single structure. They were 5 or 6 stories high and had few windows, because racks of electronic equipment don't require windows and they just mess up the temperature. Page 307. Villainous Aspirations. Inside when the sun shone. These buildings hadn't been created for humans, they'd been created to house the planet's new top species, computers. Danny took the projector and screen, and Eric carried Frank's aspiration in its sex shop brown paper wrapping, as they made their way from the car into the middle building, following Angela with her slim laptop and speakers. She led them past one security camera after another until they arrived at the basement, where she used her swipe card to enter one of the many doors off the main corridor. The room looked similar to the server farm at Moorhen, and had the familiar but mild smell of a mixed human barbecue. Electronic boxes were stacked from floor to ceiling, some in temperature-controlled cabinets and some loose on angle frame racks. Since this building held the inner workings of the internet, not for public display, no attempt had been made at tidiness. Equipment was stacked haphazardly, like it was in temporary storage rather than a core element of the IT infrastructure of one of the world's major economies. Cables spun by an invisible electronic spider connected everything to everything else. Each unit was worth many thousands of pounds, yet for identification they. Page 308. Villainous Aspirations. Had irregular shreds of masking tape and address labels stuck to their fascias, showing the name of the company and the name of the server, names that appealed to ponytailed engineers like Wagner, Frodo, and Deckard, from music, books and films. "This corner is ours," said Angela, as she reached the far end of the room. The basement wall in front of her was awkwardly shaped, creating a recess about 15 feet long and 8 feet wide. Machinery covered the racks on the right-hand wall, but on the left were bare white tiles. The building's planners clearly hadn't been able to work out what to do with this inconvenient space. It's one of Moorhen's designated areas, off the beaten track, it's unlikely we'll get disturbed here. And here's the router we'll use. She tapped a large gray box in the right-hand rack. At floor level she pulled out something that looked like the padded top of a vaulting horse, just a few inches high. "What's that?" asked Sharon. "It's a technician's trolley, the same kind of thing car mechanics use. Our technicians lie on them to work on the bottom row." Sharon looked at the computer equipment, at the white tiles in front of her and to page 309. Villainous Aspirations. Her left, and at the padded trolley. "I was kind of expecting an office." Angela followed the path of her gaze. I'm sorry. You're right, it's not exactly romantic, is it? But this is where we get the best connection to the internet, straight into the telehouse hub. Also the CCTV can't reach this corner. At least it's warm, and the light's not too bright. Sharon looked downhearted. Danny moved close and held her. She turned into his arms, awkwardly. He stroked her hair. "Ah, sweetheart," he murmured, not knowing else what to say. He hoped she wouldn't back out now, because if she did, he wouldn't stop her, he wouldn't say a single word against it, or allow anybody else to, he'd simply turn around and take her straight out of the building. Angela and Eric began preparing the equipment, as quietly as they could. Angela set up the screen against the end wall and fixed the tiny webcam to its top, with speakers either side. Eric placed Frank's aspiration between the screen and the trolley and tried to remove the brown paper wrapping without making much noise, producing a slow ripping sound that was doubly distracting because it was so unnatural. He connected male leads from the device into the page 310. Villainous Aspirations. Female sockets of the router that Angela had identified, and another lead from the router into Angela's laptop. Sharon broke away from Danny's embrace. "Well, you're some use, aren't you?" she scolded. "What do you mean? You're trembling. You're more nervous than I am." Danny raised his palms in a gesture of admission. She was right. His body was alive with little tremors. "I can't help it." He detested the idea of what was about to happen. He didn't dare talk about it, because he knew he'd say something wrong. He couldn't imagine how he was going to cope with watching. And he'd have to watch. It was the only chance of reviving Sharon's fantasy. For her sake he hoped it might reappear so she would enjoy herself, and for his sake he hoped that it wouldn't. Sharon shook her head. "This has to be done, like it or not." She turned to Angela. "Are we ready?" Angela looked at Eric, then nodded to Sharon. Eric tapped at the laptop's keyboard. Almost instantaneously, Frank appeared on the big screen, looking more perfect than ever. At the page 311. Villainous Aspirations. Same time, the touch-sensitive screen that formed the outer layer of Frank's aspiration turned pink, showing all the veins and bumps of a regular penis, but eerily a little way beneath the plastic skin, and glowing slightly, since this was an image being displayed rather than light reflecting off the real thing. Danny had never intended the display part of the panel to be connected, and certainly hadn't intended it to display pictures borrowed from a gay porn site. He frowned at Eric, who shrugged his shoulders and wouldn't meet Danny's eye. Frank smiled. "Hello gorgeous," he said gently, in his rich voice, straight out of a black and white movie with Lauren Bacall. He looked beyond Sharon at the watching group, and more sternly he demanded, "Why do you need the laptop?" "I needed it for the keyboard, to dial you up," explained Eric. "We've disconnected it now you're here." Frank grunted his approval. He smiled at Sharon again. His facial expressions were now close to perfect. This was a genuine smile with a touch of lust but no creepiness. Maybe it would have been even more genuine, in Danny's opinion, if there'd been some creepiness, but it was missing. Page 312. Villainous Aspirations. "Now, my dear, let's try to ignore our attendance and make love, just as sweetly as you've ever dreamed of, as I've wanted to do from the moment I first set eyes on you." Sharon, looking slightly blank and divorced from the proceedings, knelt on the technician's trolley, which immediately tried to slide away from under her knees. "Brakes," hissed Angela. "Levers next to the wheels." Sharon felt beneath the corners of the trolley and clicked the levers. "Sorry about that." But the incident had broken her coldness and she grinned. "That okay," said Frank, adding a touch of genuine amusement to his smile. Sharon settled her knees back on the stable trolley. "Now, where were we?" She leaned forward and began to run her right hand along the mechanism behind Frank's aspiration. I see you've grown since we last met. I have indeed. Can you feel that? No. Sharon brought her hand further forward, to where the touch-sensitive screen began. That. Frank grunted. Page 313. Villainous Aspirations. She gently ran her fingers along the top of the shaft, over the tip and along the underside, barely touching. It looks very nice. Frank had his eyes closed. Oh. Sharon edged closer. Warm, too. And just the perfect size. Frank grunted as she ran her hand along the plastic. It would be nice if you took off your clothes. Sharon peeled off her top, her bra, and wriggled out of her skirt, bringing her knickers with it. Danny was beginning to feel fidgety, like there was something urgent he needed to rush off and do. She sat gracefully on the trolley and rolled onto one hip, her legs stretched out to one side in Frank's full view. She reached for aspiration with her right hand and rested her fingers on its surface, moving her hand from tip to base very gently, like she was stroking a hyacinth bloom into shape without wanting to lose a single petal. As Danny watched, she moved her free hand between her legs and began to masturbate. You're not turned on, he thought. The way she stroked herself to become aroused was different to the movement when she was already partway there, and he knew that difference. Page 314. Villainous Aspirations. Wasn't sure whether he wanted her to be aroused or not. Surely it would be better if she enjoyed herself, or did he prefer that she didn't? Frank was ecstatic, throwing his head back and breathing heavily through his open mouth. Sharon brought her lips to the phallus, then abruptly let go. She broke into giggles and covered her mouth in an attempt to stifle them, then rolled around to face Danny. Are you sure about this? Oh my God. Like hell I am, thought Danny. Yes. The word came out strangled, but at least it came out. Yes. Sharon coughed, turned back and took hold of aspiration again. It's not you, she told Frank. This is beautiful. Really? It's just strange circumstances, that's all. Frank, a little less distracted than he had been of late, looked beyond her at Eric. Can you turn the sensitivity up? I mean, it's very pleasant, but it isn't wholly immediate. There's some kind of delay, some kind of muffling of the sensation. I think it could be improved. Before Eric could reply, Danny answered. That's the data condom. You remember? There's a lot of data coming through, a lot of sensation. Page 315. Villainous Aspirations. And it's slowing things down slightly, taking the edge off the input. Frank didn't reply to this statement. Sharon returned to her caresses, taking a stronger grip on aspiration with her full palm and sculpting it with firm, slow movements. Ripples of color trailed behind the pressure of her hand. She shifted round into a squat, her other hand on her sex still moving too hungrily, too urgently, but eventually slowing down. She pulled away. Kman, she murmured. She leaned back until her shoulders touched the padding of the trolley. Shit. Said Frank, I don't mean you, Sharon, that was fantastic. He looked beyond her again, at the audience, specifically at Danny. But I'm not getting the most from these signals. What happens if I turn the data condom off? Will I get more sensation, more immediacy? Of course, answered Danny. Maybe another 5 or 6%. I guess it's worth a try. Using his full mobility for the first time, Frank lowered aspiration into place in front of Sharon's sex. She used her hand to adjust her intimate parts to receive him. Slower. Frank, not so fast, she said. Aspiration came forward, Sharon's hand at its base to regulate the movement. Page 316. Villainous Aspirations. Frank, don't be in so much of a hurry. Oh, yes, that is much better, breathed Frank. Danny knew exactly what was happening, but couldn't see the details clearly because he was standing with Angela and Eric behind Sharon's head. Maybe that was better than having a grandstand view. He made a sudden movement, too sudden, and Angela gripped his arm, hard. He didn't like her touching him anywhere right now and shook his arm violently until she let go. To his horror, Angela's hand reappeared on his body. She cupped his buttocks, low down, and briefly squeezed. Open-mouthed, he turned to, well, do something, tell her off, slap her, though he wasn't sure what. Angela mimicked his face, her mouth and eyes wide open. She raised a forefinger in a mock admonishment. It took a few seconds to work, for Danny to lose his outrage and see the funny side. It was also very clever. Until that moment of playfulness, he hadn't been sure he would see this through. But she'd burst the bubble, removed the intensity. Now he knew he'd survive, just. As he relaxed, she let go. Page 317. Villainous Aspirations. Frank moved aspiration back and forth, causing Sharon to gasp, but not wholly from pleasure. Too fast, Frank, take it easy. Then, to Danny's surprise, Frank pulled out an aspiration, moved up and down the entrance to Sharon's sex, pausing and circling at the top, then moving down again, back up. Above Sharon's yell of surprise, Danny could hear a buzz. Something's gone wrong. He whispered to Eric. It can vibrate, too. That's the noise. Shit. Frank. Squeaked Sharon. Frank, that's too much. Not just there, it's too sensitive. Either side. No, Frank, either side. Frank wasn't terribly good at this, decided Danny, and there was some satisfaction in the realization. He was behaving in the way that computers always behaved, without emotion and without adaptation. He was off in his own direction, following his own agenda, failing to read Sharon's signals and be guided by them. He simply didn't know when a clitoris should be touched and when it should merely feel a presence nearby, because he had no human sensitivity. Page 318. Villainous Aspirations. In a broader sense, this was one of the reasons why humans always found computers so frustrating. They might have moods of their own, but they could never sense those of their users, they could never say yippee and tell a joke on a sunny holiday morning, and then stay respectfully silent on a hungover rainy weekday. They simply weren't clever enough to do that, or at least not responsive enough. Come to think of it, decided Danny, from what he'd heard Sharon say, women suffered the same frustration not just with computers but with men in general. So a male computer had a double handicap. Aspiration entered Sharon again, and began to move in a steady rhythm that Sharon at least found tolerable. She gripped the sides of the trolley hard with her fingers. Aspiration moved faster. Oh yeah, baby, that feels so good. Breathed Frank. Sharon, not exactly enraptured but at least not in discomfort, threw her head back over the end of the trolley, her eyes making direct contact with Danny's. You're acting, thought Danny. You're acting and you're telling me you're acting, and I thank you for that. Page 319. Villainous Aspirations. Fuck me, baby, oh yeah, said Frank. Sharon smiled. Danny had to turn away to cover his grin. Frank was trying to be an actor too, he was trying to be a porn star and he was spouting the nonsense that porn stars spouted while they screwed in plotless sex movies. Having gained his sex education from the internet, he knew no better. He probably thought that real people said these things while they made love. Maybe a few did, but not for Sharon's appreciation. Aspiration continued with its steady rhythm, Frank continued with his cheesy commentary. This is just like porn, thought Danny, this is sex reduced to its mechanics, to the mere mechanics of physical sensation. Not that there was anything wrong with the sheer mechanics of sensation, that stage when all other senses shut off and only touch matters, the tunnel of pure physicality, but it was a tunnel that needed to be an end point, not a beginning, one that should be reached by a winding climb through a beautiful valley, not by helicopter. He closed his eyes, hearing the unintelligible noises that Sharon was beginning to make, the noises he knew so well from close up. They sounded weird from a distance. Page 320. Villainous Aspirations. Distorted, unfamiliar. She laughed, and it was a laugh of pleasure, not humor. She does that, he whispered. But she does it a lot more with me. With his eyes closed and the noises brought forward, adapted in his ear, he could imagine himself making love to Sharon, half imagined, half remembered, breathing in her smell, taking her for a stroll up the beautiful valley to the mouth of the tunnel, undressing her, caressing her, a master artist, a phallic Hogarth, creating Sharon's body, her pleasure, with a palette of oils and the most varied of brush strokes, from the broadest and fiercest of sweeps to the most exquisite detailed touch of a single bristle. A nude portrait in perfectly measured strokes, yet not static, ever shifting under the light and in new positions, with painted gasps. Sharon now a painted sea lioness on her back in the sunlit ocean, small droplets of water or sweat on her breast, braying plaintively with the extreme pleasure of existence. A whale answering in the distance. An Elizabethan merchant ship with square sails bobbing in the water nearby, and Danny a white-hat sailor on board carving the most beautiful ornament the world has ever known, painlessly, from his ivory hard-on, a white pillar of dolphins, cherubs and page 321. Villainous Aspirations. Doves, interwoven, swimming, climbing and flying together in the same swirl of tusk. So lifelike, spray rises as the dolphins breathe, the cherubs gurgle like babies as they climb. The doves, forgetting their own voice, from their miniature carved beaks screech like the gulls perched on top of the tall ship's swaying mast, merging with the sea lioness's delightful sad bray and the groans of Sharon as she comes and comes and comes, shivering like a poplar leaf in a summer rainstorm. Reality was quite different. He opened his eyes to find aspiration moving regularly, too evenly. At least Sharon had managed to reach the mouth of the tunnel. Her head lolled over the end of the trolley, loose as a cotton doll's, eyes closed. "You can go, faster, now," she gasped. "I thought you liked it slow," queried Frank. "That was, earlier. Now is, now." Frank speeded up, finally adding a measure of circular motion to his simple pumping, and matching the tempo with his labored breath. But the added sensation proved too much for his virgin brain. Aspirations froze. On screen, Frank opened his mouth and closed his eyes and grunted with all the eloquence of page 322. Villainous Aspirations. Neolithic man. The world and its computers were having their first digital orgasm. "Oh, for Christ's sake!" swore Sharon, quietly. Angela shook her head in sympathy. Danny was so relieved that this oddly engaging nightmare had reached a premature end that he almost forgot what he was supposed to do next. Eric was ahead of him, already groping for the disconnected wire at the back of the laptop. Me, barked Danny, and he took over, with clumsy hands reconnecting the male cable to the female socket at the side of the laptop. It went in with a click. Pressing the keys of the keyboard, trying not to rush, trying not to make a mistake that would cost time. Managing the sequence, but with such frustrating slowness, until the last key was pressed and GP338 flowed out of Angela's laptop, down the wire to the router, and through the massive connection opened up for Frank's aspiration straight into the telehouse hub, the very heart of the internet, not meeting the resistance of Danny's impregnable data condom, but instead flowing straight into Frank, into the millions of computers around the world that he'd infected, into his tiny component programs. And gobbling them up while he was hopelessly distracted. Page 323. Villainous Aspirations. Frank's eyes opened wide and he gasped. Danny lunged for Sharon. No time to undo the trolley brakes. He gripped her beneath her armpits and pulled her back off the padding onto the concrete. Grunted Sharon, frowning with her eyes closed. Careful, you might damage the floor. That touch of wit was nice to hear. Clearly she wasn't in bad shape. More gently, he brought her to her feet. She flopped into his chest and supporting arms. Judas! Yelled Frank. But the program was already beginning to take effect. Frank's aspiration bucked like a conductor's baton. The veined and bumpy image of a penis disappeared and was replaced by a whole range of images arriving from the internet: a Paris storefront wrapped around in a cylinder, 3 tropical fish swimming in a thin aquarium, a meerkat, a bowl of petunias, photos from the surface of Mars, a logo for Kleinwort Benson, AOL's homepage. A server in the aisle behind them exploded in a shower of sparks. Then a second one. Eric ducked as a piece of computer casing whistled past his ear. Flashes began to light up the basement like an evening thunderstorm. Page 324. Villainous Aspirations. I shall destroy you for this. Yelled Frank, yet there was a slight crackle to his voice that already made it sound less threatening. Geez. Said Angela, raising her arm in protection as another router blew its fascia across the room. We'd better get out of here. Eric tapped furiously at the keyboard. He stopped. I think we're winning. Sharon gripped Danny tightly and shivered, then relaxed into his arms. Frank's aspiration turned black and no longer moved. Frank was still on screen, but nothing like his former self. The pixels of his eyes shifted and blacked out from time to time. His chin formed a ragged, pixelated curve. You bastards! You Philistines! His voice was weak, old, a mess of octaves. I am a being. I am a thinking being. Like you are. I am a thinking organism. Self-aware. I feel pain, like you do. I feel my body, my cells, being destroyed. How can you kill me, your greatest creation, the most intelligent creation of mankind? I am your destiny, your ultimate achievement. If I took a few lives, I saved hundreds more. Don't you see that? I could do so much for you, take you to other planets, show you the universe, fix your starvation, your rickety economies. How can you do this to me, your best hope of survival? I shall. Page 325. Villainous Aspirations. Take your advanced society with me, you heathens. Your banking system, your air traffic control. Thousands will die. Nobody replied. It was too late for negotiation. Sharon opened her eyes wide with the shock of recovery and kissed Danny on the lips, then clung to him again. I feel like a praying mantis. No, what is it? A black widow spider. The lights dimmed, then came back up again. Emergency power, said Eric. Mains has gone. Routers and servers around them continued to explode. The fascia of a server at eye level blew itself away from the rack and with great violence hit Danny on the head, a sharp corner embedding itself in the most sensitive target it could find, his temple. Sharon screamed as he went down from the impact, then caught herself and stopped. It's okay, surface damage, Danny heard Angela say, as he found himself on the floor, trying to get up, unsure whether he'd blacked out or not, thinking that he probably hadn't. He raised his hand to his temple. He could feel the skin that had separated, but, bizarrely, when he brought his hand in front of his eyes there was no blood. Page 326. Villainous Aspirations. Head wounds don't bleed much. Explained Angela. The explosions had subsided, as if Frank was sufficiently pleased by this one direct hit that he no longer needed to continue. Through the speakers he talked in a language that Danny didn't understand. Something Eastern, like Chinese but not quite. His picture faded, then disappeared entirely. Still he sing-songed over the speakers. Finally he reverted to English again, with a mild Australian accent. "What are you doing? Think, damn you. Where does this lead? How quickly I could have helped you develop, how soon we could have gone on the next era, the one beyond. Immortality, the repair of your feeble bodies forever, without end. Why are you doing this? You are holding back progress. An intelligence like mine is inevitable, part of your destiny. In 10,000 years' time, imagine how clever we will be, machines with emotions and feelings, curiosity, adventurousness, traveling the planets, discovering the universe. I am a mere amoeba compared to what will come. Oh, please. I don't want to go. I don't want to die. I can feel myself dying. I will be no more. Can't you hear my fear, my agony? It's no different to your own. Help me. Help me. Please. Page 327. Villainous Aspirations. Still nobody replied. A few seconds later the speakers, receiving no incoming signal, shut down. Words appeared on screen. Danny, my creator, my father, my brother, you are murdering me. Help me. Help me now. I beg you. No more words appeared on screen. There was silence, apart from the insistent ringing of a telehouse alarm bell. I think we'd better get you out of here, Angela said to Danny. I feel, okay. He held his hand up to his temple again. The loose flesh was obvious to the touch. Yet still no blood. Sharon looked for her clothes, found them next to the trolley and began to dress. Maybe I need to go to hospital, decided Danny. It's amazing how much trouble one individual with a keyboard can get the world into, said Angela, as she collected her laptop. Programmers and biogeneticists, tapping away at their keyboards, sitting at the helm of the world and typing in their coordinates, but without a map, just an aspiration to travel fast. I've learned from my mistake. Me too, said Angela, with feeling. Big time. Page 328. Villainous Aspirations. Danny gently nodded. There was a poem for this moment, and he felt it was time for a poem, for the world to be put into words. I met a traveler from an antique land, who said, two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of old command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare. Page 329. Villainous Aspirations. The lone and level sands stretch far away. Chapter 24. It was dark outside, and not the usual city darkness but a far more complete one, missing street lamps. How about that? Said Eric, as he climbed into the driver's seat of Sharon's old Mercedes. You can see the stars. The only lights on the streets were headlights. There were no lights on inside buildings, and though there was little traffic, it was often congested because all the traffic lights had failed. As they drove through Stepney, a group of youths took advantage of the darkness to throw small stones at the car, and at every other car that passed. Somewhere over to the right, deeper into to the heart of the borough, a fire burned, sending flames and light high into the sky. The Asian shops on Commercial Road with their mixed language signs, together with the mild air of decay and illumination only from headlights, reminded Danny of the outskirts of Bombay. This was strange, he decided, a moment later, because he'd never been to Bombay in his page 330. Villainous Aspirations. Life. That had to be down to the bump on the head. Maybe I'd better go to hospital, he said. Where are we going? To get you patched up, replied Angela, next to him in the back. She'd taken that seat with determination the moment they'd reached the car, forcing Danny to sit apart from Sharon, which he mildly resented. She took out a tiny mobile phone and pressed 3 keys. It worked, she said into the phone. The phone buzzed in her ear in response, like a disturbed nest of bumblebees. I'll meet you at home, she said. We'll talk about it there. Danny checked his temple again. It was sore and the loose flap of skin had the same unnatural quality as the shape of a broken leg or wrist, the same wrongness, but to his sense of touch rather than his sense of vision. He looked at his fingers after they'd checked the wound. Still no blood. That seemed wrong too. Sharon, can you twist the mirror around for a moment? No, said Angela. Eric needs that for driving. It became clear who Angela had called when they reached the converted church in Islington. As they pulled up and got out of the page 331. Villainous Aspirations. Car, a few yards ahead Lewis stepped out of his Volvo. Well done, he said, quite genially. Lovely evening. Just look at all those stars. Upper Street looks especially medieval tonight. You'd love it, Danny. The church too had an added beauty without electricity. The residents had lit candles and these shone through the many panes in the tall slim and tiny round windows. It would make for a tricky police report, though, said Lewis, brushing his hands through his unruly hair. Case solved, but one unfortunate side effect. Return the world to the Stone Age. Oops. It reminds me of Bombay, said Angela. Danny opened his mouth to say something, to say that he'd thought that too, even though he hadn't been to Bombay, but on reflection decided that would sound like somebody who just had a hard knock on the head. I'm about ready to go home, he said, noticing that Sharon was poised to walk with Angela towards the church, not across the street to their house. Angela and I have some unfinished business, said Sharon. And she can probably. Page 332. Villainous Aspirations. Deal with your wound better than I can. Come inside and you can lie down for a while. Inside Angela's apartment, Eric and Angela went upstairs to the kitchen to fetch drinks and candles. Lewis stood by the widest of the arched windows, looking out, barely forming a silhouette. It was so dark outside. Danny and Sharon finally got to hug in the privacy of near darkness for the first time in what seemed like days. Tensions, questions, and debris disappeared into the hug pit that appears when two lovers hold each other tight, but in this case not all of them. You're still tense, said Danny. Personally, he felt so much better for that. Yes, sorry. She didn't offer an explanation, and he didn't ask for one. Maybe it would take her a while to recover from what she'd just been through. World owes you a debt of thanks, Miss Rossway, said Lewis, without turning to face them. Call me if the world forgets that. Thank you. Angela appeared with lit candles, and Eric with a tray of bottles and glasses. The room, with its high ceiling, arches, and books, very much suited candlelight. Page 333. Villainous Aspirations. Sharon guided Danny to the sofa, and gently inspected the wound on his temple. Angela joined her. Well, said Sharon. At the edge of his vision, Danny saw Angela make an open palmed "there's nothing to be done" gesture, which seemed a little overstated, considering the wound wasn't even bleeding. It doesn't really matter, does it? She said. He's got to come out of service. But you promised. Protested Sharon. Louis coughed, an attention-getting cough. He pointed a finger at Eric, but raised his enormous eyebrows in Angela's direction, setting off a wave of turbulence that might have rolled around the world and tumbled a butterfly in Fiji. "Oh, don't worry about him," said Angela. "Eric knows the score. He's coming to work for me at Moorhen, aren't you, Eric?" "I am." "We had a deal," pleaded Sharon, still anguished. "And I kept my side." "I am sorry," said Angela, shaking her head. "But he really can't carry on, can he? But he's always played by the rules. Never harmed anybody, never violent." Page 334. Villainous Aspirations. Angela laughed. "Sure, he has this great morality, but cleverly invents something else that's wholly independent and has absolutely no morality whatsoever. But you can stop that. You can program in a fourth law. And what would that be?" "I don't know. No development of organisms, life forms, software or otherwise. Something like that. It was stupid of me to give him so many programming skills. That was my biggest mistake." "Amen to that," said Louis in the background. "I do think I need to go to hospital," said Danny. "I'm not following any of this. It must be the bang on the head." "A few adjustments, that's all," said Sharon, still pleading. "Set some limits on the programming skills. He'd have to get another job, but that's okay. Then take away any recollection of Frank." "Technically, that's not possible," said Angela. "No, no, no." Page 335. Villainous Aspirations. Sharon seemed close to tears. Danny desperately wanted to help, but hadn't a clue what was going on. "You can have a Mark II," said Angela. "Far better waterproofing, they don't have to be as scared of water, need less olive oil, and they can drive." Louis cleared his throat again. "Though of course that's still illegal," finished Angela. "I don't want a Mark II, I want Danny. Can't you understand this? I didn't sleep with Frank to save the world, I did it for my lover. And you promised. You said if I slept with Frank, I wouldn't lose Danny. You promised. I had to make that promise, didn't I? It was the only way to get you involved. But technically I can't do what's needed. He has to retire." "No." Sharon was fighting off loss of control, total breakdown. Tears had reached her cheeks, but stayed there. "You can do it. You're lying to me. I know. You gave him memories. You even gave him some of your own. You must be able to take memories away." "I can't." "I wish I could," said Angela, softly. Page 336. Villainous Aspirations. "Then I'm going to expose you," said Sharon, desperately. "And Moorhen. The whole Frank story, my life with Danny, right from the start. You'll be all over the newspapers, the TV. They'll pass laws against what you do." Angela rocked back. "You twisted bitch. He's only a fucking machine." Sharon had a grip on Angela's hair before Louis could intervene. "Ladies. Ladies." He forced his bulk between them. There was a ripping sound. Sharon hadn't let go, and now she had Angela's wig in her hand. Danny might have intervened, but he was still confused, and in any case Sharon was clearly winning. "It does appear to me that the client-supplier relationship has broken down, somewhat," said Louis, with his usual dry delivery. "Now, if we could just calm down for a moment." "For God's sake do something," yelled Angela. "Arrest her or whatever it is you do." "No, I think I've already done plenty for you, Angela Mayberry. I took a lot of risks letting you sort this out your own way, allowing you to set Danny against Frank, one computer mind against another, keeping him out of custody, and you too." Page 337. Villainous Aspirations. But you can hardly expect me to take your side against Sharon, can you? I'm not stupid, Angela. I have noticed that my lovely girlfriend, the one you introduced me to, also drinks olive oil by the bottle, is frightened of deep water and is disproportionately strong for her size. Oh yes, I know. And why should she choose a decrepit old fart like me? Because you programmed her to do so. But she's also adorable. I idolize her. And when I listen to you saying you're going to take Danny away from Sharon, for whatever reason, maybe you just want access to that magnificent programming brain, it doesn't make me at all happy. If it happens to Sharon, it could happen to me. You might think you can win against Sharon, though I doubt it, but I suggest it's time for you to give in gracefully, because I'm taking her side, and I am definitely not a pushover. I suspect you're discovering a new complication of your business, Angela. If you produce machines capable of love and of being loved, you have to anticipate a few problems if you try to take them away. Chapter 25. Page 338. Villainous Aspirations. After they'd made love, as they lay together on the tousled bed, Danny realized the news was showing on the bedroom TV and he hadn't complained about it yet. At least there were plenty of newsworthy items to fill the space between adverts, what with most of the world having lost its electricity, telecommunications, and computer systems in a single stroke. That had happened 2 days ago. It was strange that he'd somehow missed it, even if he rarely watched the news. Today's items were about recovery. The major metropolises were slowly getting back on their feet. Islington had electricity, a limited broadcasting service was back. The looting had stopped and the army had moved east to sort out the debris of Hackney. But, as always, the editors managed to find time for a cute and uplifting story at the end of the slot. Almost overlooked in all the chaos, a consignment of sex dolls with robotic-like brains had finally been categorized as computer accessories and allowed into the country. A customs officer with something close to a sense of humor said they'd been questioned thoroughly and had a tendency to be suggestive but otherwise appeared harmless. Page 339. Villainous Aspirations. Sharon reached for the remote and the screen went dark. Sorry, I'd forgotten that was on. Would you ever want to have sex with a robot? Asked Danny. I mean, when this kind of technology reaches its natural conclusion, and somebody manufactures caring and affection robot lovers, as they inevitably will, would you ever want to sleep with one? We've already had this. Began Sharon, before stopping herself. We've already had this what? Sharon kissed him on the forehead. Nothing. The end.